What if everything you thought you knew about the ancient world was based on a story that was meant to be forgotten? Imagine the foundational myths of entire civilizations, the very tales that dictated their laws, shaped their morals, and defined their identities for generations, were not the complete picture we have inherited. For centuries, our understanding of history has been built upon the narratives that survived, the ones deemed important enough by kings and priests to be copied and preserved. But what about the stories that were deliberately erased, the scrolls that were buried, or the myths that were simply lost to the relentless march of time? Today, we are going on a journey to uncover those secrets, to read the pages that history tried to hide. We are delving into the world of lost myths, narratives so powerful they had the potential to rewrite the fundamental rules of ancient societies, from the ziggurats of Mesopotamia to the pyramids of Mesoamerica. The discovery of a single, forgotten text can act like a seismic shock through our understanding of the past. It can challenge the very pillars upon which we believed ancient empires were built. Think of a myth not as a simple fairy tale, but as the operating system for a civilization. It explains why the king has the right to rule, how the people should behave, and what the gods truly desire. When a new, contradictory myth emerges from the dust of an abandoned archive or a sealed tomb, it doesn't just add a footnote to history. It forces us to reconsider everything. It reveals that the past was a battleground of ideas where different factions promoted their own versions of truth. The stories we have long accepted were often the ones that served the powerful, while alternative visions, potentially more radical or inclusive, were silenced, hidden away beneath the earth or beneath layers of newer text. This exploration is about more than just satisfying our curiosity about the past. It is about understanding the origins of our own world. The cultural and legal systems we live with today have deep roots in these ancient narratives. By recovering the myths that were lost, we gain a priceless perspective. We see that our current ways of thinking about power, justice, and community are not the only ways they have ever been imagined. These rediscovered tales offer us alternative blueprints for society, challenging us to question the dominant stories of our own time. So prepare to step into the shadows of history with us. We will venture into crumbling libraries, decipher enigmatic symbols, and listen as the voices from these buried scrolls finally speak. The journey to bring these transformative stories to light starts right now. To truly grasp the power of a lost myth, we must first step inside the places where knowledge was kept, the very heart of ancient power itself. Picture not a quiet, dusty library, but a bustling, highly secure scriptorium deep within a Sumerian temple complex or an Egyptian royal palace. The air is thick with the smell of clay and ink. These archives were fortresses of information, and the scribes were their gatekeepers. This was not a passive storage space. It was an active, living center where the cultural identity of a civilization was actively shaped and sanctioned. Every story inscribed onto a clay tablet or a papyrus scroll was a deliberate choice. Think of it this way: writing something down in a society where literacy was a rare and powerful skill was an act of immense significance. It was a way of saying, this story is true, this story is important, this story shall be remembered. Conversely, the decision to not write a story down, or worse, to destroy existing copies, was a powerful act of censorship, a silencing of alternative voices. The archive was the ultimate filter, determining which versions of reality would be passed down to future generations. The materials themselves tell a story of both permanence and fragility. In Mesopotamia, scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets, creating cuneiform. Once baked in the sun or a kiln, these tablets could survive for millennia, as the fires that destroyed cities often only hardened them further. This is why we have such a rich, if fragmented, record from places like Nineveh. In Egypt, the preferred medium was papyrus, a paper-like material made from reeds. While far easier to write on and store, papyrus is incredibly vulnerable to dampness. A papyrus scroll buried in a dry, sealed tomb could survive intact for thousands of years, but one left in a library susceptible to Nile floods or simply the humid air of time would crumble to dust. Then there were codices, the early form of books with bound pages made from parchment animal skin or vellum higher quality calfskin. These were more durable than papyrus but were often scraped clean and reused in a process known as creating a palimpsest, literally burying one text beneath another. The survival of any ancient text is a minor miracle, a precarious dance between the intentionality of human preservation and the unpredictability of environmental luck. This combination of human choice and material chance is why the rediscovery of a lost archive is so monumental. When archaeologists unearth a collection of tablets that had been buried by a collapsed roof or carefully sealed in a jar, they are not just finding old objects. They are effectively cracking open a time capsule that contains the worldview of a specific group of people at a specific moment. They are recovering voices that the official channels of history may have tried to suppress. Perhaps it was a collection of myths belonging to a rival political faction that fell from grace. Maybe it was the private library of a scribe who held unorthodox beliefs, texts he dared not share widely. The very fact that these stories were hidden away or accidentally preserved outside the main, sanctioned archives suggests that they represented a different perspective, a competing truth. Understanding that these ancient libraries were centers of control, not just neutral repositories, completely changes the meaning of finding a text that managed to escape that control. It transforms a simple archaeological find into a key that can unlock a door we never knew was closed. So we arrive at our first case study, a discovery that came not from a grand royal library, but from the fragmented remains of tablets unearthed in the ruins of a much more modest building, perhaps the home or workshop of a scribe who dared to think differently. For centuries, our understanding of Sumerian religion has been dominated by a clear, almost military-like hierarchy. At the very top sat the god Enlil, the supreme ruler whose word was law, the king of the gods who commanded the other deities and dictated the fate of humanity. It was a system that perfectly mirrored the rigid, top-down structure of Mesopotamian kingship. But the myth found on these broken pieces of clay presents a startlingly different cosmic order. This is the tale of the dispossessed gods, a group of lesser deities known as the Anunnaki who are tasked with the most grueling labor, digging canals and tending the land, the back-breaking work that sustained civilization. According to this recovered narrative, these worker gods grew weary of their endless toil, but they did not launch a violent, chaotic rebellion like the ones we see in other mythologies. Instead, they chose a path of brilliant, peaceful innovation. They went away and, using their divine intelligence, they invented something extraordinary: tools. They created the plow to break the earth efficiently, the hoe to tend the crops, and the shovel to build irrigation channels. These weren't just objects, they were amplifiers of human potential. They presented these inventions to the High Council of Gods, not as weapons, but as solutions. The story details how these tools fundamentally improved existence, reducing the burden of labor for both gods and humans alike. And because of this contribution, because they had added value and order to the world through their creativity, the high gods, including Enlil himself, had to acknowledge their worth. The myth concludes with these formerly dispossessed deities being granted a new, elevated status and a rightful share in the divine assembly. Their authority was no longer based on the raw power they were born with, but on the merit of what they had built. This simple shift in the story is nothing short of revolutionary. It rewrites the fundamental rules of divine power. Instead of authority being an unchangeable birthright, a static hierarchy enforced by primordial strength, this myth suggests that power can be earned. It can be negotiated and shared based on tangible contributions to the common good. The implication for Sumerian society would have been profound. Think of the artisans, the metalworkers, the engineers, and the farmers, the very people whose innovations in irrigation, architecture, and craftsmanship built Mesopotamia. This myth would have given them a theological justification for their importance. It said that the god who represented their craft was not a lowly servant, but a respected innovator who had earned a seat at the highest table. This creates a concept of social mobility that is utterly fascinating. While society was still hierarchical, this narrative cracks open a door, suggesting that value and status are not fixed but can be achieved through skill and beneficial invention. The discovery of this myth forces a complete re-evaluation of what we thought we knew. For a long time, scholars viewed Mesopotamian religion as a reflection of a despotic, unchanging social order. But this lost tale reveals a vibrant, intellectual debate happening within the culture itself. It shows that there were competing ideas about the nature of power, both divine and earthly. Perhaps this version of the myth was favored by the merchant and artisan classes in cities like or Lagash, serving as a counter-narrative to the royal ideology that emphasized the king's unbreakable connection to Enlil. The fact that this story survived on a tablet, even a fragmented one, is evidence that this alternative worldview persisted. It wasn't completely erased. It was buried, waiting for us to find it and understand that the ancient world was just as complex, just as full of competing ideas about justice and merit as our own world is today. The rules of their civilization were not as set in stone as we believed. They were being debated and rewritten even then, in the stories they told in the shadows. But who held the pen, or rather the stylus? The survival of a myth was not just a matter of clay and papyrus. It was in the hands of a fascinating and often overlooked figure, the scribe. We must move beyond the image of a simple copyist mechanically reproducing text. In the ancient world, a scribe was a scholar, a theologian, and in many ways a creative author. Literacy was a rare and powerful skill, a key that unlocked access to the divine and the political. These individuals were not just writing words, they were shaping the very worldview of their civilization with every mark they made. The act of transcription was never a perfectly neutral process. A scribe's own personal beliefs, their family's political allegiances, or the direct orders of a royal patron could all seep into the text, subtly altering a story as it passed from one generation to the next. Imagine a scribe working in the court of a new pharaoh who has just seized power from a rival dynasty. The old myths might have glorified the previous ruling family, tracing their lineage back to a specific god. Our scribe, under the watchful eye of his new patron, might be tasked with updating these stories. This wouldn't necessarily mean writing a completely new myth. The change could be incredibly subtle. Perhaps the name of the old king is replaced with the new one. Maybe an epithet describing the god's favor is tweaked to better align with the new regime's propaganda. A single word changed in a key passage could shift the entire theological justification for power. This was not always crude censorship. It was often a sophisticated form of editing, a way to ensure that the sacred stories continued to validate the current political reality. The scribe became a mythmaker in the most literal sense, actively participating in the evolution of tradition. Some of the most compelling physical evidence of this process comes from palimpsests, manuscripts where the original text was scraped or washed away to make room for a new one. The word itself comes from Greek, meaning scraped again. In an age where writing materials like parchment were expensive and time-consuming to produce, recycling was common. A scribe would take an older book, carefully remove the ink from the pages, and write a new text on the now clean surface. For centuries, these later texts were all that scholars could see. But with modern technology like multispectral imaging, we can now peer beneath the surface. We can recover the ghost of the original writing that was meant to be erased forever. And what we find is astonishing. Sometimes the text that was scraped away is a version of a well-known story, but with crucial differences. It might be a more elaborate account, or one that includes details that later authorities found inconvenient or theologically problematic. The palimpsest is a perfect metaphor for the transmission of myth. The official, approved version is written boldly on top, but just beneath it, often hidden in plain sight, lies an alternative narrative, a whisper from a different past. Each palimpsest is a silent witness to the fact that the stories we have received are not necessarily the only ones that existed. They are simply the ones that someone, at some point, decided were the most useful to preserve on the precious surface of the page. This role of the scribe as the gatekeeper of cultural memory was one of immense responsibility, but also of profound temptation. They held the power to include or exclude, to emphasize or downplay. A scribe sympathetic to a particular religious sect might, when copying a sacred text, ever so slightly amplify the role of their preferred deity. A scribe from a merchant family might ensure that a myth highlighting the importance of trade was copied with special care, while allowing a story glorifying only the warrior class to languish and perhaps be lost. This was not necessarily an act of malicious fraud. It was a reflection of the human element inherent in all storytelling. The scribes were the filters through which the river of tradition flowed. They decided which tributaries were allowed to merge into the main current and which were dammed up and forgotten. Understanding this is absolutely crucial as we examine the content of the lost myths themselves. When we unearth a text that contradicts the standard narrative, we are not just finding an old story. We are very likely recovering a perspective that was filtered out by the gatekeepers of a later era. We are hearing a voice that the dominant power structure, for whatever reason, did not want amplified. The scribe's hand was the final editor, and in their choices, whether made out of fear, loyalty, or personal conviction, the course of history itself was often quietly rewritten. Now, let us travel from the sun-baked plains of Mesopotamia to the lush, life-giving banks of the Nile, to a civilization whose grandeur and mystery have captivated the world for millennia. When we think of ancient Egyptian mythology, our minds immediately conjure images of Osiris, the murdered and resurrected god-king, his devoted wife Isis, and their triumphant son Horus. This is the foundational drama, the mythic cycle that cemented the pharaoh's identity as the living Horus, the direct and unquestioned heir to the divine throne. It is a powerful narrative of order triumphing over chaos, of legitimate succession. But what if this was not the only story the Egyptians told about the source of royal power? A remarkable discovery, a set of papyri found in a long-neglected tomb in the Theban necropolis, offers a startling alternative. This text, likely hidden away for safekeeping, presents a myth centered not on a male god, but on a powerful, fearsome goddess, perhaps a figure like Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of war and healing, or Hathor, the cow goddess of love, music, and cosmic nourishment. In this narrative, the pharaoh's right to rule is not an automatic inheritance from Ra, the sun god. Instead, it is something that must be actively granted, even earned, through the approval of this formidable feminine divine force. The plot of this recovered myth is a dramatic confrontation, a divine contendings. It describes a time of crisis for the kingdom, a period of instability or foreign threat. The pharaoh, despite his claimed lineage, finds his authority weakened. In his desperation, he does not appeal to Ra or Horus alone. He must seek out the goddess in her sacred precinct, confronting her terrifying and majestic presence. The text vividly portrays this encounter. the goddess is not a gentle, passive figure. She is a manifestation of raw, untamed power, the searing heat of the sun, the protective fury of a mother, the unpredictable force of nature itself. She tests the pharaoh. She might challenge his wisdom, his courage, or most importantly, his commitment to Maat, the fundamental principle of cosmic order, truth, and justice. The pharaoh must prove he is not just a descendant of gods, but a ruler worthy of the crown, one who will uphold the balance of the universe and care for the land and its people. Only after he successfully navigates this trial does the goddess grant him her explicit endorsement, symbolized by a sacred gesture, perhaps the bestowal of the ankh, the symbol of life, or the rearing Urius cobra upon his brow, a sign of her fiery protection. The theological implications of this story are profound. It completely rewrites the rules of Egyptian divine kingship. The standard narrative presents a neat, linear, and patriarchal transfer of power, from Ra to Osiris to Horus to the pharaoh. It is a system of automatic divine right where bloodline is everything. This lost myth, however, introduces a crucial conditional clause. It says that royal authority is not just given, it is validated. The goddess represents a different kind of power base, one rooted in the land itself, in the primal forces of creation and destruction, in a maternal authority that predates the solar cult of Ra. By making the pharaoh's power contingent upon her approval, the myth creates a system of checks and balances within the divine realm. The king rules not merely because he is the son of a god, but because he has the backing of the mother of gods, the fierce protector of Egypt. This provides a powerful theological framework for the very real political influence wielded by women behind the scenes throughout Egyptian history. Think of the formidable queen mothers and royal wives like Tiye, the wife of Amenhotep III, or the famous Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh herself. In the official, male-centric records, their power is often framed as exceptional or downplayed. But this myth suggests there was an ancient, deeply rooted theological precedent for their authority. The goddess in the story is the divine counterpart to the human queen mother. Her approval of the pharaoh legitimizes not only him but also the women in his life who act as his advisors and intercessors. The queen could be seen as the earthly embodiment of this goddess, the one who possesses the wisdom and connection to the primal forces necessary to guide the king and ensure his reign aligns with Maat. This narrative would have given female political influence a sacred mandate, embedding it within the very fabric of the state's religious ideology. The discovery of this papyrus forces us to look at the carved reliefs on temple walls with new eyes. When we see a depiction of a pharaoh receiving life from a goddess, it may not be just a symbolic gesture. It could be a direct reference to this alternative myth, a public acknowledgement that his power flowed through a channel that was fiercely, fundamentally feminine. This lost narrative reveals that the concept of kingship in ancient Egypt was far more complex and nuanced than a simple father-to-son inheritance, resting also on a sacred contract with a divine maternal power that could both grant and withdraw its favor. While the deliberate actions of scribes and rulers shaped much of what survived, we must also account for the immense, unpredictable role of pure chance. For every myth that was actively suppressed, countless others simply fell victim to the relentless passage of time, their fragile pages crumbling into dust. This is where the story takes a thrilling turn, moving from the realm of human intention into the domain of archaeological serendipity. Our historical record is not just a curated collection. It is a patchwork of incredible accidents, a series of miraculous survivals against all odds. The preservation of a text often hinged on a perfect, almost impossible alignment of environmental conditions. A papyrus scroll that would have rotted away in a matter of decades in a humid climate could survive for millennia in the hot, dry, sterile air of an Egyptian desert tomb. Conversely, a catastrophic event like a volcanic eruption which instantly snuffed out a community could also act as a perfect time capsule, freezing a library in a single tragic moment. These are not deliberate acts of preservation, but rather the capricious whims of fate that have granted us windows into worlds we otherwise would have lost forever. Consider the most famous example of this paradox: the utter destruction of the Roman towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. The pyroclastic flows that buried Herculaneum under superheated gas and volcanic material carbonized hundreds of scrolls in the magnificent villa of the Papyri. For centuries, these lumps of charcoal were considered irrecoverable, the ultimate tragedy. Yet, in a twist of irony, that very process of carbonization, while making the scrolls incredibly fragile, also preserved their structure. The intense heat burned away the organic material but left a carbonized ghost of the papyrus and its ink. Today, with cutting-edge technology like sophisticated X-ray phase contrast tomography, scientists are beginning to virtually unroll these scrolls and read their contents without ever physically touching them. This library, which belonged to a Roman aristocrat with a taste for Greek philosophy, is slowly giving up its secrets. It's a stunning reminder that what was once a symbol of total loss is now becoming a beacon of recovery, all because of a natural disaster followed by a technological miracle. Perhaps an even more dramatic story of chance is the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library. In December 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for fertile soil, a soft clay called sabak, near the town of Nag Hammadi. His hoe struck something hard, a large, sealed jar buried in the soil. At first, he was afraid to open it, fearing a jinn or spirit might be inside. But thoughts of buried treasure overcame his fear, and he smashed the jar open. Instead of gold, he found 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 separate texts. Disappointed, and reportedly concerned his mother might use the ancient papyrus pages for kindling, he eventually brought them to a market. He could never have imagined that he had just unearthed one of the most significant religious discoveries of the 20th century. These were Gnostic Gospels, alternative accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus that had been condemned as heresy by the early Orthodox Church and systematically hunted down for destruction. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas, with its collection of Jesus' sayings, and the Gospel of Philip, which offered a more mystical interpretation of Christianity, had been lost for over 1,500 years. Their survival was a fluke, a happy accident of a jar being sealed and hidden, likely by monks from a nearby monastery who wanted to protect these forbidden books from being burned. A farmer's simple search for fertilizer literally reshaped modern understanding of early Christian diversity. These stories of volcanic ash and sealed jars highlight a humbling truth. The archive of the ancient world that we possess is not a representative sample. It is a wildly biased collection, skewed heavily toward what could survive in very specific, often arid conditions. The moist, temperate climates of Europe, for instance, have been far less kind to organic materials like parchment and papyrus. How many Celtic myths written on parchment and stored in wooden temples have been completely lost to the damp? How many stories from the great libraries of the ancient world, like the Library of Alexandria, vanished not in a single famous fire, but through centuries of slow decay, insect damage, and the simple recycling of materials? The historical record is not just incomplete, it is a collection of fragments that survived by a combination of luck and location. This element of chance adds a layer of profound drama to the work of archaeologists and historians. Every dig is a gamble. A team might spend years excavating a promising site, only to find that the acid soil has dissolved all traces of written material. Another might stumble upon a treasure trove in a place deemed insignificant, all because a single jar remained sealed. This uncertainty makes every new discovery feel like a gift from the past, a message in a bottle that somehow, against all odds, managed to wash up on the shores of the present. It reminds us that for every myth we have recovered, there are countless others waiting in the earth, their survival dependent on a fragile and unpredictable chain of events. Now we travel across the ocean to a world shattered by conquest, to the vibrant, complex civilizations of Mesoamerica. The arrival of Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century was not just a military invasion. It was an ideological assault, a systematic campaign to erase an entire way of thinking. Priests like Diego de Landa, in a fervor to stamp out what they deemed pagan idolatry, gathered thousands of Maya codices, beautiful screen-fold books made of fig bark paper, and set them ablaze in massive auto-da-face. In a single, tragic act, centuries of accumulated knowledge, history, and mythology were reduced to ashes. This deliberate destruction created one of the greatest voids in our understanding of the ancient world, leaving us with a history told primarily by the victors, filtered through the often misunderstanding eyes of the Spanish chroniclers. Our perception of societies like the Maya and Aztec has been permanently shaped by this catastrophic loss, painting a picture of rigid, blood-soaked theocracies ruled by an unchallengeable nobility. But against all odds, a precious few of these codices survived. Some were hidden away by indigenous communities who risked everything to preserve their heritage, secreted in caves or buried in sacred ground. Others, like the famous Dresden Codex, made their way to Europe as curiosities for collectors, their contents misunderstood for centuries. It is within one of these rare survivors, a codex whose origins remain shrouded in mystery, that we find a myth so revolutionary it challenges the very foundation of Mesoamerican social order as we think we know it. This is the story of the dual-souled hero, a figure whose existence proposes a radical alternative to the divine right of kings. The narrative centers on a protagonist not born in a royal palace, but who emerges from a place of obscurity. Through a series of trials and visions, this hero undergoes a profound spiritual transformation. He does not simply receive the favor of a single god, he achieves something far more profound. He successfully integrates two powerful, opposing animal spirits within his very being, the jaguar and the serpent. In the cosmology of Mesoamerica, these animals were not just symbols, they were potent manifestations of cosmic power. The jaguar was the lord of the earthly realm, the dense, mysterious underworld of caves and the night. It represented raw strength, shamanic power, and the secrets hidden beneath the surface of the world. The serpent, particularly the feathered serpent known as Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs or Cuculcan to the Maya, was a creature of the sky, associated with wisdom, wind, rain, and the celestial cycles. It represented the ordered, intellectual, and creative forces of the upper world. These two spheres, the underworld and the upper world, were typically separate domains, often in tension. Priests and kings would seek communion with one or the other, but the idea of a single individual fully embodying both was extraordinary. The dual-souled hero becomes a living bridge, a mediator who can navigate the chaotic, creative potential of the underworld and the structured, life-giving order of the heavens. He holds the entire cosmos in balance within himself. This spiritual duality directly challenges the political structure we associate with empires like the Aztec or the classic Maya. The standard historical model presents a society with a strict, almost unbreachable hierarchy. At the top was the king, the Ajor or Titanomachy, who claimed direct descent from the gods. His bloodline was his legitimacy, his right to rule was as fixed as the stars in the sky. The nobility and priesthood formed a closed circle around him, and power was inherited, not earned. But the myth of the dual-souled hero introduces a completely different pathway to authority. Here, leadership is not a birthright, it is an achievement. It is earned through spiritual prowess, through the difficult, personal journey of mastering profound inner forces. The hero's power comes from within, from his hard-won integration of opposites, not from a royal genealogy recorded in a palace archive. The implications of this narrative are staggering. It provides a theological and mythological justification for social mobility. It suggests that a person from outside the noble class, a gifted shaman, a visionary artist, or an exceptionally skilled warrior, could, through their own merits and spiritual accomplishments, attain a level of authority that rivaled or even surpassed that of the hereditary elite. Imagine a powerful shaman in a Maya city-state who was renowned for his ability to traverse the spirit world. According to the orthodox royal ideology, he should always be subservient to the king. But if this myth was known and believed, it could empower that shaman. His influence would not be seen as a challenge to the king's power, but as a parallel source of authority, grounded in a different, equally valid spiritual tradition. It creates a system where power is fluid and multifaceted, where a commoner who demonstrates extraordinary connection to the cosmos could rise to a position of immense respect and influence. This myth rewrites the rules by proposing that the most important qualification for leadership is not who your ancestors were, but the balance and power you can cultivate within your own soul. It presents a vision of Mesoamerican society that was far more dynamic, far more open to talent, and far more intellectually sophisticated than the rigid, pyramidal structure described in the Spanish chronicles. The survival of this codex is a testament to a hidden current of thought, a belief that true greatness could be found in the integration of the whole cosmos, not just in the purity of a royal bloodline. This drive to control the narrative brings us to one of the most powerful and chilling motives for a myth to become lost: deliberate political suppression. We have seen how environmental luck and scribble choices played their part, but this is different. This is the intentional, systematic erasure of a story because it posed a threat to the new order. When a new dynasty seized the throne, when a revolutionary religious movement took hold, or when a conquering army subjugated a people, the incoming authorities faced a fundamental challenge. How do you make people forget their old loyalties? How do you dismantle the ideological foundation of the previous regime? The answer was often shockingly literal. You attack the very stories that gave that regime its legitimacy. You seek out the tablets, the scrolls, the inscriptions that contain the competing narrative, and you destroy them. In doing so, you aren't just burning paper or smashing clay. You are attempting to murder memory itself, to ensure that the only version of history that survives is the one that serves the powers of the present. The ancient Romans had a formal practice for this, a phrase that captures the cold efficiency of the process: Damnatio Memoriae, which translates to condemnation of memory. This was not a random act of vandalism. It was an official senatorial decree pronounced upon an emperor or a high-ranking official who had fallen from grace, often after their death. The goal was to erase every physical trace of that person from the public record. Statues bearing their likeness were toppled and melted down for reuse. Their name was meticulously chiseled off of inscriptions on monuments, triumphal arches, and public buildings. Coins with their profile were withdrawn from circulation and melted. In the most extreme cases, historical records were altered to remove any mention of their deeds. The person was to become a non-person, a ghost in the historical machine. Think of the Emperor Geta, the younger brother of the Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century AD. After Caracalla had Geta murdered, he instituted a thorough Damnatio Memoriae. In a famous painted tondo or round portrait, the face of Geta was scraped away, leaving a ghostly blank space next to his brother. This was a powerful visual statement. This man never existed. His story, his claim to power, his very identity were now illegal. The practice reveals a profound understanding of power. That authority is rooted in public perception, and perception is shaped by the stories a culture tells about itself. By surgically removing a figure from the narrative, the state could rewrite the past to solidify its present control. An even more dramatic example comes from Egypt, with the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten in the 14th century BC. Akhenaten was a radical revolutionary. He attempted to fundamentally overhaul Egyptian religion, suppressing the worship of the entire traditional pantheon, led by the powerful god Amun, and replacing it with the exclusive worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented as the sun disk. To cement this theological revolution, he built a new capital city, Amarna, and fostered a new artistic style. For a brief period, the old myths and the names of the old gods were sidelined. But Akhenaten's revolution was short-lived. After his death, the traditional priesthood of Amun, whose power and wealth had been severely undermined, staged a massive counter-revolution. The boy king Tutankhamun, initially named Tutankhaten, was pressured to change his name and restore the old gods, and then the systematic suppression began, but this time it was directed against Akhenaten himself. His city was abandoned and dismantled. His monuments were torn down. His cartouches, the oval rings containing his royal name, were meticulously chiseled off the walls of temples and tombs. The official king lists of Egypt were edited to skip directly from his father, Amenhotep III, to his successors, as if Akhenaten's 18-year reign had never happened. He was subjected to a Damnatio Memoriae so effective that he was virtually unknown to scholars until the 19th century. The myth of Amun's supremacy was reinstated by physically destroying the alternative narrative Akhenaten had tried to impose. This was a clear case of a myth being lost not by accident, but by a conscious, politically motivated campaign to purge it from existence. The underlying principle here is as relevant today as it was in antiquity. Narrative control is a primary tool of governance. The stories a culture tells about its origins, its heroes, and its gods are not just entertainment. They are the bedrock of its identity, the source of its values, and the justification for its social and political structures. A ruler who controls those stories controls how people perceive reality. If you can convince a population that the previous ruler was a tyrant, a fool, or a heretic, then your own seizure of power becomes not a coup but a liberation. If you can erase the myths that gave a conquered people their sense of unique destiny, you can more easily assimilate them into your empire. This is why the Spanish conquistadors burned Maya codices. It's why the early Christian church labeled certain gospels as apocryphal and sought to destroy them. It's why, throughout history, libraries have been prime targets during invasions and regime changes. The destruction of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad or the Library of Alexandria, whether the full extent is historical fact or powerful legend, symbolizes an attack on the very memory of a civilization. Understanding this political motive completely changes the significance of finding a lost myth. When archaeologists unearth a text that contradicts the official narrative, they are not just filling a gap in our knowledge. They are recovering a voice that was silenced. They are finding evidence of a struggle, of a competing ideology that the winning side tried to wipe from the face of the earth. Every such discovery is a small act of historical justice, a correction to the record written by the victors. It reminds us that the smooth, monolithic history we often read in textbooks is an illusion, a simplified version that has been heavily edited by centuries of power dynamics. The recovery of a suppressed myth is disruptive because it forces us to acknowledge that the past was a contested space, full of debates, alternatives, and roads not taken. It shows us that the rules of ancient civilizations were not always peacefully agreed upon. Sometimes they were enforced by the hammer and chisel of those who had the power to decide what was remembered and what was condemned to be forgotten. But what happens when we dare to read the history of the cosmos not from the perspective of the victors, but from the vanquished? We now turn to the very bedrock of Greek mythology. the foundational war that established the rule of Zeus and his Olympian family, the Titanomachy. For millennia, this epic struggle has been presented as a clear-cut battle of good versus evil, of progressive order against primitive chaos. The Olympians, led by the wise and powerful Zeus, were the heroes who overthrew the tyrannical, archaic Titans, led by Cronus, and ushered in a new age of justice and civilization. It is a story so deeply ingrained in our cultural consciousness that it feels like an inevitable, universal truth. Yet, the discovery of a single, fragile scroll, carefully preserved in the library of a Roman-era villa in Herculaneum, challenges this entire narrative. This text dares to tell the Titanomachy from the other side, giving voice to the Titans themselves, and in doing so, it transforms a simple myth into a profound philosophical inquiry into the nature of power and propaganda. In this recovered version, the Titans are not the grotesque, chaotic monsters of Hesiod's Theogony. Instead, they are portrayed as the original architects of the cosmos, vast, primordial forces who embodied the fundamental laws of the universe. They were not chaotic, they were orderly, but it was an order of a different kind, the slow, patient, cyclical order of geology and astronomy. Cronus, often depicted as a mere devourer of his children, is reimagined as a stern but necessary ruler whose reign was defined by balance and the measured passage of time, a period the Greeks would later nostalgically refer to as the Golden Age. The scroll describes how the Titans shaped the raw materials of creation, setting the stars in their courses and establishing the rhythms of the seasons. Their power was not born of brute force alone, but was an intrinsic part of the world's structure. They were less like petty tyrants and more like the governing principles of nature itself, immense, impersonal, and ancient. The conflict, then, is reframed not as a righteous rebellion, but as a violent coup d'etat led by a younger, more ambitious, and arguably more brutal generation. Zeus and his siblings are portrayed not as liberators, but as usurpers who valued raw power and personal dominion above the ancient, impersonal balance maintained by their forebears. The text describes the weapons of the Olympians, the lightning bolts forged by the Cyclopes, not as tools of justice, but as instruments of terrifying, unprecedented violence that shattered the old order. The war becomes a tragic, cosmic revolution where a sophisticated, if rigid, system is overthrown by a new one that is more dynamic but also more prone to the whims and passions of its individual rulers. The Olympians win not because their cause is morally superior, but because their tactics are more ruthless and their weapons more destructive. In this telling, the familiar narrative of Zeus freeing his siblings from Cronus's belly reads less like a heroic rescue and more like the first move in a carefully planned insurgency. This alternative perspective is electrifying because it forces us to see Greek mythology not as a fixed collection of sacred stories, but as a form of ancient political propaganda. The version of the Titanomachy that survived and became canonical was the one promoted by the cults of Zeus and the other Olympian gods, the dominant religious powers of the Greek world. It was in their interest to portray the previous regime as monstrous and unjust, thereby legitimizing their own rule. By demonizing the Titans, the Olympians cemented their own status as the bringers of a better, more just world. This scroll from Herculaneum suggests that there were other, competing traditions, perhaps older ones that lingered in certain regions or among certain philosophical schools, which remembered the Titans differently. The survival of this text is a stark reminder that the myths we know are the ones that were endorsed by the most powerful institutions of their day. The implications of this lost narrative extend far beyond theology and into the very heart of Greek philosophy. Consider the pre-Socratic philosophers, thinkers like Anaximander or Heraclitus, who were active in the 6th and 5th centuries BC, questioning the nature of the universe. They pondered concepts like justice, conflict, and the fundamental substance of reality. The standard Olympian mythology presented a world ruled by anthropomorphic gods whose actions were often capricious and self-serving. But what if some of these philosophers had access to, or were influenced by, this alternative Titanomachy, a myth that portrayed the cosmos as originally governed by impersonal, titanic forces of nature, would provide a much more fitting mythological precursor to their abstract philosophical ideas. It could have inspired them to look beyond the personal dramas of Zeus and Hera to search for a more fundamental, underlying principle, the archie, or first cause that governed existence. This lost myth offers a bridge between the world of personalized gods and the birth of natural philosophy, suggesting that the questioning of Olympian authority had deeper roots than we previously imagined. Ultimately, this scroll does more than just add a new story to the Greek canon. It fundamentally challenges the authority of the narrative we have always accepted. It forces us to ask a critical question that resonates far beyond the ancient world. How much of history is written by the winners? The Titanomachy from the Titan's perspective is a powerful metaphor for every suppressed account, every silenced voice, every alternative version of events that was lost because it was not convenient for the ruling powers. It reminds us that myth is not a static record of belief, but a dynamic arena where different visions of the world competed for dominance. The victory of the Olympians was not just a military one, it was a victory of storytelling. By recovering this lost perspective, we are not just learning about Greek gods, we are engaging in an act of historical reclamation, giving a voice to the silenced and acknowledging that the past, like the present, is always more complicated, more contested, and more fascinating than the official story would have us believe. Finding a lost scroll or a cache of tablets is a moment of pure exhilaration, a triumph for archaeology. But that moment of discovery is merely the first step on a much longer and often far more difficult journey. A text written in an unknown script is like a locked treasure chest without a key. It holds unimaginable secrets, but they remain utterly inaccessible until someone can crack the code. This is the domain of the Decipherer, the linguistic detective who performs the delicate magic of bringing a dead language back to life. These scholars engage in a form of intellectual archaeology, excavating meaning from symbols, one painstaking connection at a time. It is a discipline that demands a rare combination of immense patience, logical brilliance, and a deep, intuitive feel for the flow of language itself. The process often begins with the search for a Rosetta Stone, a term that has entered our language for good reason. The actual Rosetta Stone, discovered in 1799 by French soldiers in Egypt, is the ultimate key. It's a single slab of black basalt that bears the same decree, written in 3 different scripts: ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Demotic Egyptian script used for everyday purposes, and most importantly, ancient Greek. Because scholars could read Greek, they had a known quantity to compare against the unknown. The race to decipher the hieroglyphs was a fierce international competition, ultimately won by the French scholar Jean-François Champollion in 1822. His breakthrough came from recognizing that the hieroglyphs weren't just pictograms representing whole ideas, they could also represent sounds like an alphabet. He identified the names of pharaohs like Ptolemy and Cleopatra enclosed in cartouches or oval rings, and used those to match hieroglyphic signs to Greek letters. This was the pivotal moment, the first turn of the key in the lock, which then allowed him to unravel the entire system, finally giving voice to a civilization that had been silent for nearly 2,000 years. But such a perfect key is exceptionally rare. More often, decipherers have to work with far less, starting from almost nothing. This was the challenge faced by Michael Ventris, an English architect who was obsessed with the ancient script known as Linear B. Found on clay tablets at Knossos in Crete and later on the Greek mainland, Linear B was a complete mystery. It was clearly a syllabic script where each sign represents a syllable, but the language it recorded was unknown. For decades, scholars debated whether it was a form of early Greek or something entirely different, perhaps a language lost to history. Ventris approached the problem with architectural precision. He created vast grids, cataloging which signs frequently appeared together and which never did. He looked for patterns that might represent place names or common words. In a stunning intellectual leap, he made a working assumption that the language was, in fact, an archaic form of Greek. He then began testing this hypothesis by assigning sound values to the signs based on his patterns. When the signs began to form recognizable Greek words like tai-rai, po for tripod, and ko-wo for boy, he knew he was on the right track. Ventris's achievement was monumental. He didn't just decipher a script, he proved that Greek was spoken in the Aegean centuries earlier than anyone had believed, rewriting the early history of Greece. The work of these decipherers is intensely collaborative and cumulative. It is not the solitary pursuit of a genius in a dusty room, but a global conversation among specialists. A breakthrough by one scholar in Paris can provide a crucial clue for another in London or Chicago. This collaborative spirit is perfectly illustrated by the reconstruction of the world's oldest great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. The epic wasn't discovered as a single, complete book. It was found as thousands of broken clay tablet fragments, scattered across the ruins of several Mesopotamian cities like Nineveh and Babylon, written over a period of 1,000 years in different versions of cuneiform. The task of piecing it together fell to generations of Assyriologists. They had to first sort the fragments, matching the handwriting and the physical breaks in the clay like a jigsaw puzzle. Then they had to transliterate the cuneiform signs into a readable alphabet, and finally translate the Akkadian language into English or other modern tongues. Because the story was found in multiple copies, scholars could use a complete section from one tablet to fill a gap in another. The epic we read today is a magnificent patchwork, a testament to the patience and dedication of countless individuals who slowly, fragment by fragment, reassembled the story of the king who sought immortality. This entire endeavor is, in its own way, a modern mythic quest. It is an adventure story of the mind, a battle against time and oblivion. The decipherer is the hero who ventures into the labyrinth of an unknown script, armed only with logic and intuition, facing the minotaur of total incomprehension. Their reward is not gold or glory, but something far more precious, the recovery of a lost world. When a language is deciphered, it is not just words that are regained. It is the thoughts, the fears, the jokes, the laws, and the dreams of an entire people. A mundane tablet listing deliveries of barley suddenly reveals the rhythms of an ancient economy. A royal inscription boasts of a victory, but a personal letter whispers of a family dispute, and a myth, like the ones we have been exploring, can finally be read in its original voice, allowing us to hear the inflections and nuances that were lost in silence for millennia. Without the meticulous, often thankless work of decipherment, the most spectacular archaeological find would be nothing more than a beautiful, silent object. It is the decipherer who breathes life into the clay and papyrus, who turns inscribed symbols back into stories, and who ensures that these long-lost voices can once again speak to us across the ages. From the Greek cosmos, where the very definition of victory was thrown into question, we now journey to the banks of the Indus and Ganges rivers, to the world of ancient Vedic thought. The hymns of the Rig Veda, composed over 3,000 years ago, form the bedrock of Hinduism and present a universe brought into being through powerful, often masculine, acts of sacrifice and will. We hear of gods like Indra, the warrior king who slays the chaos serpent Vritra, or Prajapati, the lord of creatures who generates the world through a cosmic act of procreation. This is a creation narrative that seems to mirror a patriarchal social order with a clear hierarchy of divine powers. But nestled within this vast collection, in the 10th book, is a hymn so unique and so philosophically radical that it stands apart from all others. It is known as the Purusha Sukta, the hymn of the cosmic person, and it offers a vision of origins that is not just inclusive, but fundamentally androgynous, presenting a creator who embodies the totality of existence within a single, unified being. The hymn describes Purusha, a primordial giant with 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, and 1,000 feet. This is not a humanoid figure in a simple sense, but a personification of the entire cosmos itself, a being of such immense scale that it envelops the whole of creation, past, present, and future. But the most revolutionary detail comes next. The text explicitly states that Purusha is both male and female. This single characteristic transforms the entire concept of creation. Instead of a male god acting upon a passive female principle, or a mother goddess giving birth alone, here we have a single entity that contains the complete potential for both genders within itself. Creation, then, is not an act of domination or even external procreation. It is an act of internal division, a sacred sacrifice where Purusha allows itself to be ritually dismembered. From this self-offering, every part of the universe springs forth. The moon is born from its mind, the sun from its eyes, the air from its breath. The four main social classes or varnas of ancient Indian society, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras are described as emerging from Purusha's mouth, arms, thighs, and feet respectively. This last point is often emphasized, but to focus only on the social hierarchy is to miss the hymn's profound cosmological balance. The entire universe, from the highest god to the lowest creature, from the most abstract thought to the most physical element, is shown to be interconnected, all originating from the same singular source. The social classes are not presented as a divinely sanctioned hierarchy of worth, but as interdependent parts of a single cosmic body, each with its own essential function for the whole to exist. This vision of creation as a unified, self-dividing whole presents a concept of duality that is not about conflict or opposition, but about complementary balance. Male and female, heaven and earth, mind and matter, these are not warring opposites. They are inseparable aspects of the same original reality, partners in the great drama of existence that were once, and fundamentally still are, one. This narrative stands in stark contrast to the direction that Vedic society and its later interpretations would take. Over the centuries, as the Vedic period gave way to the era of the Brahmanas and other texts, the religious and social systems became increasingly stratified. The role of the Brahmin priests grew more powerful, and the hierarchical structure of the Varnas solidified into the more rigid and hereditary caste system. In this evolving context, the more straightforward, patriarchal creation myths, which emphasized a clear chain of command from a father god, were far more useful for legitimizing a social order based on birthright and male authority. The complex, balanced duality of the Purusha Sukta, with its inherent message of fundamental unity and interdependence, posed a philosophical challenge to this trend towards strict social stratification. Its vision of a creator who was both male and female could have provided a theological foundation for a more equitable view of gender roles and social classes. It suggested that since everyone, regardless of their social standing or gender, originated from the same cosmic body, all shared in the same fundamental divine nature. The marginalization of this hymn's deepest meaning was likely not a single act of suppression, but a gradual process of interpretation that emphasized certain elements over others. Later commentators could focus exclusively on the part about the four Varnas emerging from different body parts to justify the caste system, conveniently downplaying the hymn's initial, revolutionary statement of androgyny and unity. The idea that the ultimate reality was non-dual beyond gender, and that all apparent divisions were merely manifestations of a single whole, became a central tenet of later Hindu philosophy, particularly in the Upanishads and Advaita Vedanta schools. But in the early Vedic period, the Purusha Sukta stands as a remarkable, explicit articulation of this concept. It rewrites the rules of cosmic origins by proposing that the universe was born not from an act of separation between opposing forces, but from an act of integration within a single force. It presents a world where difference is not a reason for hierarchy, but a necessary and beautiful expression of an underlying oneness. This lost perspective, waiting to be fully appreciated within one of the world's oldest texts, reminds us that the quest for balance and unity is as ancient as the first questions humanity ever asked about its own existence. Up until now, we've explored how lost myths reshape our understanding of ancient beliefs and social structures. But what if these stories could do something even more concrete? What if they could literally change the dates in our history books? The rediscovery of a forgotten myth doesn't just add a new chapter to a culture's spiritual life. It can send shockwaves through the very framework of historical chronology, forcing us to redraw timelines we thought were settled. While archaeologists rely on physical evidence, the layers of a city mound, the style of a piece of pottery, the carbon dating of a bone, these artifacts often tell a silent story. They can show us that a city was destroyed by fire, but not why. They can reveal a grand palace, but not the name of the king who ruled from it. This is where myth, when treated as a historical document, becomes an invaluable partner to the trowel and brush. A myth can provide the narrative that gives meaning to the rubble, offering names, events, and motivations that pure material evidence can only hint at. Consider the challenge of early Chinese history. For centuries, scholars wrestled with the accounts of the Xia dynasty, recorded in later historical texts like the Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. According to these accounts, the Xia was the first legendary dynasty of China, founded by Yu the Great, a heroic figure who tamed a devastating kingdom-wide flood by tirelessly constructing canals and dams for 13 years, never passing his own house 3 times. For a long time, many Western historians were deeply skeptical, dismissing the Xia and Yu as purely mythical figures, allegories for the beginnings of Chinese civilization rather than records of actual rulers. The timeline was based on story, not stone, and thus considered unreliable. This skepticism began to crumble in the 20th century with the archaeological discovery of the Urartu culture. Located in the Yellow River Valley, Urartu was a vast, sophisticated Bronze Age society with evidence of palatial complexes, advanced bronze casting workshops, and a clear social hierarchy. Its location and date, roughly corresponding to the period traditionally assigned to the Xia dynasty, were too coincidental to ignore. Suddenly, the myth of Yu the Great took on a new, startling significance. The story of a catastrophic flood was no longer just a fantastical tale. It could be a distant, amplified memory of a real environmental crisis that shaped early state formation. The myth's emphasis on Yu's engineering prowess and his ability to mobilize labor across different tribes perfectly explained the kind of centralized authority needed to build the massive structures found at Urartu. The narrative provided a why. Why did this complex society emerge here? Perhaps precisely because the collective trauma of a great flood required a coordinated, large-scale response, elevating a leader like Yu to a position of unprecedented power. The myth, cross-referenced with the archaeology, helped to transform the Xia dynasty from a legend into a plausible historical reality, filling a crucial gap in China's chronological record and providing a cause for its earliest moves toward civilization. This powerful synergy between text and trench works for natural disasters as well. The Minoan civilization on Crete was one of the great maritime powers of the Bronze Age, with its magnificent palace at Knossos. Then, around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, its influence dramatically waned. Archaeologists found evidence of widespread destruction on Crete, but the cause was a mystery: invasion, internal revolt, or something else. For clues, they turned to a later Greek myth, recorded by the philosopher Plato centuries after the fact, the legend of Atlantis. While Atlantis is often dismissed as a philosophical fable, some historians have long suspected it contains a kernel of memory about a real catastrophic event. The key was linking the myth to physical science. Geological evidence began to mount that the volcanic island of Thera, just north of Crete, suffered one of the most violent eruptions in human history around 1600 BC. The eruption would have generated colossal tsunamis that would have smashed into the northern coast of Crete, devastating its ports and fleet. The subsequent ashfall would have crippled agriculture for years. The myth of Atlantis, with its description of a sophisticated island kingdom that sank beneath the sea in a single day and night of misfortune, suddenly reads like a garbled, exaggerated, but fundamentally real account of the Thera catastrophe and its impact on Minoan Crete. The timeline, once based solely on pottery sequences and radiocarbon dating from the ash layer on Thera, gained a narrative dimension. The myth doesn't give us a precise date, but it provides a dramatic cause for the archaeological evidence of collapse. It confirms that this was not a slow decline but a sudden, catastrophic event so traumatic that it echoed in stories for 1,000 years. This fusion of geological data, archaeological findings, and mythological memory allows historians to construct a far more vivid and accurate chronology of the Bronze Age Aegean, pinpointing a specific natural disaster as a pivotal turning point in history. Perhaps the most direct impact on chronology comes when a myth names a specific ruler previously unknown to history. For decades, the historicity of certain kings in the Hebrew Bible was questioned due to a lack of external evidence. Then, in 1896, archaeologists excavating the temple at Thebes in Egypt made a stunning discovery: a victory stele erected by the pharaoh Merneptah, son of Rameses II. The stele, dating to around 1200 BC, boasts of Merneptah's military victories in Canaan. Among the conquered peoples, it contains the earliest known mention of Israel outside the Bible, referring to it as a people or tribe already established in the land. This single line of text, an inscription that is itself a form of royal myth-making, had a monumental effect on historical chronology. It provided an independent, fixed date proving that a group identified as Israel existed as a significant entity in Canaan by the late 13th century BC. This forced a major recalibration of timelines concerning the settlement of the Israelites in the region, moving the discussion from pure speculation into the realm of datable history. Ultimately, these recovered stories provide something that potsherds and postholes cannot: the inner life of a civilization. A myth is a window into how a people perceived themselves, their origins, and their place in the world. When we read an Egyptian myth that glorifies a pharaoh's divine birth, we are not just learning a fairy tale, we are understanding the official ideology used to legitimize his dynasty. When we decipher a Mesopotamian myth about a great flood, we are accessing their deep-seated fear of environmental chaos and their belief in the god's power to punish and renew. This narrative layer adds color, motive, and emotion to the stark outlines provided by archaeology. It turns a chronology from a simple list of dates and events into a rich, multi-dimensional history, complete with the hopes, fears, and worldviews of the people who lived it. By treating myths as historical documents, we acknowledge that the past is not just a sequence of things that happened, but a tapestry of stories that people told about why they happened. And sometimes the most powerful truth is found not in the cold, hard fact, but in the enduring power of the tale. Our journey now takes us to the windswept shores of the north, to a mythology defined by its stark and brutal finality. The image of Ragnarok is seared into our collective imagination, a world-ending battle on the plains of Vigrid, where gods and giants and monsters clash in a final, glorious conflagration. Odin is devoured by the wolf Fenrir, Thor falls to the serpent Jormungandr, the sun is swallowed, the stars vanish, and the earth itself sinks beneath the waves. It is the ultimate Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods that seems to celebrate a heroic, if doomed, resistance against an inevitable chaos. This is the Norse apocalypse as we have known it for centuries, a story that seems to perfectly reflect the harsh realities and warrior ethos of the Viking Age. But what if this cataclysmic end was not the final word? The discovery of a particular, recently re-examined Icelandic manuscript, a codex often overlooked in favor of the more famous poetic Edda, suggests a startling sequel to this cosmic drama. It contains a prophecy that looks beyond the smoke and ruin of Ragnarok to describe the world that slowly, miraculously, emerges from the ashes. This is not a world rebuilt through further violence, but one founded on principles of wisdom, reconciliation, and a hard-won peace. The manuscript details how, after the fires have burned out and the floods have receded, the earth rises again from the sea, incredibly fertile and green. A new sun, the daughter of the old one, warms the land, and from the shadows and sheltered places, survivors begin to appear. These are not the old gods of power, but their heirs. We meet Vidar and Vale, the sons of Odin, who did not fall in the great battle. More importantly, we are introduced to the children of Thor, Modi and Thrud, who inherit their father's strength, and most significantly, his daughter, who carries his mantle as a protector of this new world. But the most pivotal figures are the offspring of the slain god Balder, the beloved and just deity whose death originally set the chain of events toward Ragnarok in motion. Balder himself returns from the underworld, cleansed of the tragedy that marked his first life. This new pantheon, a generation defined by loss and survival rather than by primal conquest, gathers not on a battlefield, but on the idyllic field of Ida, where Asgard once stood. Their first act is not to raise new fortifications or forge new weapons. Instead, they sit in council, they talk, they hold a assembly where they recount the old stories, the mistakes of their fathers, and the high cost of endless strife. In this new order, the rules of power are completely rewritten. The authority of these new gods does not come from their prowess in battle or their ability to intimidate. It flows from their collective wisdom, their commitment to justice, and their shared trauma. They find the golden game pieces, the tablet, that the Aesir gods once played with in their youth, symbols of a time before rivalry and suspicion poisoned their relationships. This rediscovery is deeply symbolic. It represents a return to a state of play, of strategy without bloodshed, of order achieved through intellect and agreement rather than brute force. The prophecy describes a world where fields bear harvest without being sown, a classic image of a golden age, suggesting that harmony among the divine leads directly to prosperity and ease for the earth itself. The cycle of violence that began with the Aesir's war against the Vanir and escalated through generations of betrayals and killings is finally broken. The ultimate purpose of Ragnarok, in this light, was not merely to destroy a corrupt and doomed world, but to clear the ground for something more sustainable and fundamentally more just. This alternative ending has profound implications for how we understand Viking Age ethics and social ideals. The popular image of the Norse world is dominated by the warrior code of the sagas, a culture that celebrated martial glory, honor gained through conflict, and a fatalistic acceptance of a violent end. Kings and chieftains derived their legitimacy from their success in battle and their ability to distribute plunder. But this prophecy of a peaceful aftermath offers a powerful counter-narrative. It suggests that within the Norse worldview, there was a deep-seated recognition that a society built solely on martial prowess was ultimately self-destructive. The myth provides a theological model for a different kind of leadership, one based on the wisdom to negotiate, the strength to forgive, and the vision to build rather than to break. For a Viking Age ruler listening to a skald recite this prophecy, the message would be clear. The greatest legacy is not the battlefield you leave behind, but the prosperous and harmonious community you establish. It elevates the role of the law speaker, the wise judge who resolves disputes at the Althing, to a divine level, presenting conflict resolution as a sacred, world-preserving act. This lost narrative forces a complete re-evaluation of Norse eschatology. Instead of a linear progression toward a definitive, fiery end, we see a cyclical pattern of death and rebirth, much like the seasons of the far north, where the long, dark winter always gives way to the returning sun. Ragnarök becomes not the finale, but the necessary, terrible winter that must come before the spring. The destruction is a purification, a burning away of the old grudges and unsustainable hierarchies that had plagued the divine realm. The survival of the younger generation signifies hope and the potential for learning from the past. This myth would have offered profound comfort and a sense of purpose to a people who lived with the constant threat of famine, disease, and conflict. It said that even after the worst catastrophe imaginable, life not only goes on, but it can be better. It validates resilience, patience, and the quiet work of rebuilding. The discovery of this prophecy in an Icelandic manuscript reminds us that the Norse mind was capable of profound philosophical complexity, envisioning a future where the echoes of battle fade, and the sound that remains is the peaceful conversation of survivors, determined to create a world where the mistakes of the past are not repeated. This ability to speak truth to power through myth reveals a fascinating and dangerous dimension of ancient storytelling. We often think of these narratives as pure fables or straightforward religious dogma, but in reality, they were often the safest medium for social and political critique. In societies where openly questioning a king or a priest could lead to exile or execution, the mythic realm provided a veil of plausible deniability. A storyteller could stand in a public square and recite a tale about the gods on Mount Olympus or the antics of a deity in the Egyptian underworld, and everyone listening would understand the subtext. They would hear the echoes of their own world, their own rulers, and their own grievances reflected in the divine drama. This was dissent disguised as entertainment, a way to challenge the status quo without directly naming names, using the distant, hallowed past as a shield against the dangers of the present. The most effective tool in this covert critique was often the trickster figure, a character archetype found in mythologies across the globe. These were not the noble heroes or the all-powerful creator gods. They were clever, chaotic, and irreverent beings like the Norse Loki, the West African Anansi the spider, or the Native American coyote. Their stories frequently involved them using their wits to outsmart a more powerful, but often arrogant and foolish, authority figure. Imagine a myth circulating in an ancient kingdom where the pharaoh was considered a living god. To directly say the pharaoh could be foolish or greedy was unthinkable, but to tell a story about a trickster god who manages to steal the sun god Ra's favorite scepter by exploiting his pride. That was permissible. The audience would laugh at the trickster's audacity, but they would also internalize the underlying message that even the highest authority can be blinded by its own vanity and outmaneuvered by intelligence. The story reinforces the idea that power does not equate to infallibility. It creates a space for people to question, even if just in their minds, the absolute authority of their ruler. It's a psychological release valve for social pressure, allowing discontent to be expressed and shared safely under the cover of a traditional tale. Scribes, the guardians of these written traditions, played a doubly dangerous game. While copying a well-known myth, a scribe with dissident leanings could introduce subtle alterations that shifted its meaning. They might slightly exaggerate the foolishness of a god-king in a particular episode or add a new line of dialogue where a humble farmer speaks a profound truth that shames the ruling deity. These changes, small enough to avoid detection by a casual censor, could fundamentally alter the story's moral. The survival of such subversive versions was precarious. If a text was deemed too openly critical, it risked being purged from the official archives. The loss of a myth, therefore, is not always a simple accident of time. It can be the result of a successful campaign of ideological cleansing. A new administration, sensitive to any challenge to its legitimacy, would have its own scribes scour the libraries for texts containing inconvenient narratives. Those scrolls or tablets would be singled out for destruction, their clay shattered or their papyrus burned, ensuring that the dissenting voice was permanently silenced. This is why the modern recovery of such a text is so electrifying. When archaeologists unearth a myth that portrays a god-king in a negative light or champions the cunning of a commoner over the brute force of an aristocrat, we are not just gaining a new story. We are overhearing a whispered conversation from the ancient world. We are recovering the voice of the powerless, the perspective of the governed, the critique that dared not speak its name openly. It gives us a far more democratic and complex view of these societies. We see that alongside the grand monuments and the official propaganda praising the ruler's divinity, there existed an undercurrent of skepticism and satire. The people were not merely passive recipients of royal ideology. They were active participants in a cultural dialogue, using the only tools available to them, story and symbol, to question, critique, and imagine alternatives. These lost myths of social critique remind us that the human desire for justice and the instinct to question authority are as ancient as civilization itself. This journey from the frozen north brings us to the warm, fertile plains of ancient China, a civilization whose longevity and stability were famously underpinned by a powerful political idea, the mandate of heaven. This concept was the ultimate source of legitimacy for any ruler, a divine approval granted to a just and virtuous leader and withdrawn from a tyrant, often signaled by natural disasters or popular unrest. For centuries, we have understood this virtue, primarily through a moral and military lens. The ideal emperor was a sage king, a benevolent ruler, and a mighty warrior who defended the realm from barbarian hordes and internal chaos. But what if there was another, far more practical path to earning heaven's favor? A remarkable discovery, a set of texts written on bamboo slips unearthed from a tomb dating to the Warring States period, offers a startlingly different blueprint for leadership. It tells the legend of a king, perhaps a mythical precursor to the more famous Yu the Great, whose claim to the throne rested not on his skill with a sword, but on his genius with a surveying rod and a shovel. This is the story of the engineer king, a ruler who conquered not armies but rivers. The myth itself reads like a manual of statecraft written as an epic. It begins with a kingdom in crisis gripped by a terrible famine, but the cause is not an invading army, it is a rampaging river. Annual floods have burst their banks, destroying crops, drowning villages, and leaving the people destitute. The current king, a warrior of some renown, is powerless. His armies cannot fight the water, his decrees cannot command the rains to stop. In this moment of desperation, a figure emerges from the scholarly or artisan class. He is not a nobleman, but he possesses an extraordinary mind. He has spent years studying the flow of water, the lay of the land, the composition of soil. He approaches the court and presents a radical solution, not a prayer or a sacrifice, but a plan. He proposes a monumental project of hydraulic engineering, a series of canals, dikes, and reservoirs designed not merely to hold back the floodwaters, but to tame them, to redirect their life-giving force and banish their destructive power. The narrative then details the king's incredible hands-on leadership. This is not a ruler who delegates from a palace throne room. He is depicted on the front lines, covered in mud, working alongside the thousands of laborers conscripted for the task. He personally takes measurements, adjusts the angles of canals, and tests the strength of embankments. The text emphasizes his technical knowledge, his understanding of mathematics and physics. He invents new tools for surveying and earth moving. The project is long and fraught with setbacks. A canal collapses here, a dike proves too weak there. But the king perseveres, solving each problem with calm ingenuity. Finally, after years of toil, the system is complete. The next time the rains come, the river rises, but it is channeled. The floodwaters are captured and distributed through the new network of canals, irrigating fields that were once barren. The famine ends, and the kingdom enters an unprecedented era of prosperity and peace. It is this tangible result, this demonstrated ability to improve the lives of every subject through practical wisdom, that convinces the people, and by extension heaven itself, that this engineer is the true king. His mandate is earned through concrete achievement. This myth presents a revolutionary alternative to the warrior king archetype that dominates so much of ancient history. It fundamentally rewrites the rules of legitimate power. Instead of valor on the battlefield, it champions competence in public works. The ultimate virtue of a leader in this narrative is their ability to harness technology for the common good. This had profound implications for the development of Chinese statecraft. From a very early period, Chinese empires were massive, complex bureaucracies concerned with managing a huge population and a vast territory. The central government's ability to tax, to census, and to maintain order depended on a stable agricultural base, which in turn depended on controlling water. The legend of the Engineer King provided a powerful mythological precedent for the immense, state-sponsored water management projects that became a hallmark of Chinese civilization. It justified the enormous expenditure of resources and labor on infrastructure, framing it not as a burden, but as the sacred duty of a legitimate ruler. This narrative also elevates the status of the technocrat, the engineer, and the bureaucrat to a level nearing the sacred. In a society with a rigid social hierarchy, where scholars and officials occupied a high rank, this myth gave their work a divine sanction. It said that the meticulous administrator who could design an efficient irrigation system, or the accountant who could fairly distribute grain reserves, was engaging in a form of virtue as important as the courage of a general. This idea resonates deeply with the bureaucratic nature of later Chinese empires, particularly the Han and the Tang, where governance was carried out by a class of scholar officials selected through rigorous examinations. The myth of the Engineer King suggests that this meritocratic ideal, where leadership is based on knowledge and skill rather than mere birth or brawn, has very deep roots in the Chinese imagination. It presents a vision of power that is fundamentally pragmatic and collective. The king's greatness lies not in his individual prowess, but in his ability to organize and direct the collective effort of his people toward a goal that benefits everyone. This is a concept of leadership built for the long term, focused on sustainability and prosperity rather than the fleeting glory of conquest. The survival of this myth on bamboo slips hints that this practical, administrative vision of power was a potent and respected strand of Chinese political thought, one that would ultimately help build one of the most enduring civilizations on Earth. But before a myth could be etched into clay or inked onto papyrus, it lived in a far more volatile and vibrant realm, the human voice itself. For centuries, even millennia, these foundational stories were not read but heard, passed down from one generation of storytellers to the next around flickering fires and in bustling market squares. This was the world of oral tradition, a dynamic ecosystem where myths were not fixed monuments but living, breathing organisms, constantly adapting and evolving. With every performance, a skilled bard or elder might adjust the tale, subtly emphasizing a character's bravery to please a specific chieftain, incorporating a local landmark to make the story more relatable to a particular village, or shortening a complex genealogy if the audience grew restless. The myth was a collaborative creation between the storyteller and the listeners, shaped by the immediate context of its telling. This fluidity was its greatest strength, allowing the narrative to remain relevant and meaningful to each new generation, bending and shifting like a river finding its course. The revolutionary act of writing a myth down fundamentally altered this relationship. The flowing, adaptable river of oral storytelling was suddenly channeled into a permanent, unchangeable canal. The specific version of a myth that a scribe chose to transcribe was, in that moment, frozen in time. This was rarely a neutral decision. The version deemed worthy of the expensive materials and the scribe's valuable time was almost invariably the one sanctioned by the powers that be, the king, the priesthood, or the ruling elite. It was the version that best supported the current political order, the established religious dogma, or the social hierarchy. By committing this single iteration to writing, it gained an aura of absolute authority and finality that the fluid oral versions could never possess. The written text became the official record, the definitive account, while the countless other variations that continued to circulate orally were gradually marginalized, viewed as mere folktales or corruptions of the true story. The written word didn't just record a myth, it actively worked to standardize it to create an orthodoxy. This creates a fascinating and often misleading paradox for modern historians. When we recover an ancient written text, we are not necessarily finding the original or the most authentic version of a myth. More often than not, we are discovering the winner of a long-forgotten cultural contest. The version that made it into the archive is the one that served the interests of the archive's owners. This means that a myth discovered on a cuneiform tablet in a royal Assyrian library likely presents a worldview that benefited the Assyrian king. It emphasizes his divine right, his military prowess, and the supremacy of his patron god. But what about the stories told by the farmers in the fields, the merchants in the caravans, or the artisans in the workshops? Their oral versions of the same cosmic events might have focused on themes of fertility, trade, or craftsmanship, giving greater prominence to different deities or offering a more critical perspective on royal authority. These alternative narratives, lacking the imprimatur of written permanence, have almost entirely vanished, leaving behind a historical record that is heavily skewed toward the perspective of the powerful. This is precisely why the discovery of a lost written text can be so revelatory. In some remarkable cases, the text we find does not represent the new, official orthodoxy, but rather, it captures a snapshot of the older, more diverse oral tradition that the orthodoxy sought to replace. Imagine a scribe, perhaps an older man trained before a recent religious reform, who is tasked with copying the newly approved version of a creation myth. Unwilling to let the old stories he learned from his grandfather disappear completely, he might discreetly write down the traditional oral version on a separate tablet and hide it away. Centuries later, when archaeologists unearth that tablet, they are not just reading a myth, they are eavesdropping on a conversation between two different eras of belief. The recovered text becomes a time capsule, preserving a strand of the oral tradition that was actively being suppressed by the written standard. It shows us that the seemingly monolithic religion of an ancient civilization was actually a tapestry of competing regional traditions and evolving beliefs. a vibrant oral culture that was largely paved over by the smooth, authoritative road of the written canon. Understanding this delicate dance between the spoken and the written word is absolutely essential to grasping why some myths were preserved for eternity, while others were allowed to fade into silence. The transition from an oral to a literate culture was not a simple upgrade from primitivism to sophistication. It was a profound shift in how knowledge was controlled, stored, and authorized. Oral traditions are inherently democratic, but also fragile. They live only as long as there are people to remember and retell them. Written traditions are authoritarian and durable. They can outlast civilizations, but they privilege a single, static perspective. The myths we have inherited are the ones that survived this great filter, a filter made of clay, papyrus, and, most importantly, political and religious power. By recognizing the oral world that lies just beneath the surface of every written text, we learn to read between the lines, to listen for the echoes of the stories that were never written down, the voices that were ultimately silenced by the scratch of the scribe's stylus. This concept of a sacred contract between a ruler and the very earth they walk on offers a breathtaking contrast to the myths of divinely ordained kings we've encountered elsewhere. While the pharaohs of Egypt derived their authority from the sun god Ra, and Mesopotamian kings claimed a direct line to deities like Enlil, the Celtic world presents a profoundly different source of legitimacy. Here, sovereignty was not a top-down bestowal from a distant sky god, but something that bubbled up from the ground itself, a power inherent in the hills, rivers, and forests. A king did not own the land, rather, the land allowed him to be its steward and representative. This idea is beautifully preserved in a fragmentary manuscript, perhaps from medieval Ireland or Wales, that recounts the story of a prospective king's encounter with the goddess of the land herself, a figure known in various traditions as Eriu in Ireland, or a sovereignty goddess like the one who tests heroes in the Welsh Mabinogion. The narrative unfolds not on a battlefield but in a liminal space, often a misty well or a mysterious forest clearing. The king, often a young aspirant to the throne, comes across a horrifying sight, a hideous old hag, a crone who is decrepit and repulsive. She is a personification of the land in a time of blight, a territory suffering under a poor ruler or awaiting a true king. This hag makes a shocking demand of the young man. She asks for a kiss, or in some versions, to share his bed. The true test of kingship lies in his response. If he recoils in disgust, refusing her based on her appearance, he fails instantly, proving himself unworthy. His reign would be one of superficiality, valuing only the beautiful and the strong, and the land would remain barren under his rule. But if he shows compassion, if he embraces the hag or grants her request with respect, a miraculous transformation occurs. The wretched crone instantly transforms into a radiantly beautiful maiden, the goddess in her true form, and she offers him a golden cup of ale or mead, the sacred drink of sovereignty. In that moment, the land itself consents to his rule. The rivers will flow full, the crops will grow abundant, and the people will prosper, because the king has proven he values the essence of the land beyond its temporary appearance. This myth dramatically rewrites the rules of kingship by making authority a conditional contract, not an absolute right. The king's power is directly tied to the health and fertility of the kingdom. If he rules unjustly, if he becomes greedy or cruel, the contract is broken. The myths are filled with stories of kings who, through a wrongful act, cause a blight to fall upon the land, a concept known as Fyr-Flathiman, the ruler's truth. A king's personal integrity was not a private matter, it was a public utility, the very engine of the kingdom's well-being. This creates a system of breathtaking accountability. The land itself becomes a barometer of good governance. A famine isn't just bad luck, it's a direct reflection of the king's failure to uphold his side of the sacred bargain. This myth provided a powerful ideological check on royal power, a way for the druids, bards, and the people themselves to hold a ruler to account. It said, "Your right to rule comes from your ability to care for us and this earth, and if you fail, your legitimacy evaporates." The environmental implications of this belief system are profound, especially to our modern eyes. It encodes an ancient form of ecological wisdom that saw humanity not as separate from nature, but as an integral part of a living, responsive whole. The well-being of the human community was inextricably linked to the health of the natural world. A king was expected to be knowledgeable about the seasons, the migration of animals, and the management of resources. His role was that of a mediator between the people and the environment, ensuring that hunting, farming, and settlement were conducted in a sustainable way that honored the spirit of the place. This stands in stark contrast to the later, more common model of a conqueror king who subdues and exploits the land. The Celtic model is one of partnership and reciprocity, a sacred duty to protect and nourish the source of all life. This lost narrative offers a powerful alternative blueprint, reminding us that the deepest roots of environmentalism may be found not in modern political movements, but in these ancient stories that understood the land not as a possession, but as a living partner in the great contract of life. The thrill of discovery, of holding a piece of the ancient world in your hands, is a powerful emotion, but in our modern era, that moment of triumph is almost immediately followed by a complex set of difficult questions. The quest to unearth these lost scrolls, while driven by a noble pursuit of knowledge, is no longer a simple adventure. It is fraught with ethical dilemmas that force us to confront the very methods and motivations behind our fascination with the past. The era of the colonial era archaeologist who could arrive in a foreign land, excavate a site, and ship its treasures back to a museum in London, Paris, or Berlin as a trophy of imperial power is rightly over. We now operate in a world acutely aware of cultural patrimony, the legacy of colonialism, and the fundamental rights of indigenous peoples. The central, thorny question is this: who truly owns the past? This is not an abstract debate. Consider the long-standing and emotionally charged case of the Parthenon marbles, also known as the Elgin marbles. In the early 19th century, Lord Elgin, a British ambassador, obtained permission from the then-ruling Ottoman Empire to remove about half of the surviving sculptures from the Parthenon in Athens. He shipped them to Britain, where they were eventually sold to the British Museum. For over 200 years, they have been one of its star attractions. But from the perspective of modern Greece, these magnificent carvings are not merely art objects. They are the soul of their national heritage, violently removed during a period of foreign occupation. The Greek government has been formally requesting their return for decades, arguing that they are an inseparable part of the monument they were designed to adorn, a symbol of their cultural identity. The British Museum, however, has resisted, often citing a 19th century legal contract and arguing that the marbles are part of a universal museum accessible to a global audience. This standoff encapsulates the core conflict. Is cultural heritage the property of the nation-state from which it originated, or is it a shared treasure of all humankind, best preserved and displayed by major international institutions? There are no easy answers, but the conversation forces us to acknowledge the power dynamics at play. The ability to hold onto another culture's patrimony is, in itself, a lingering echo of colonial power. The ethical challenges become even more profound and personal when we move from national treasures to sacred objects and human remains. For many decades, museums across the United States and Europe housed thousands of artifacts, funerary objects, and even the skeletons of Native American ancestors, excavated often without the consent of their descendant communities. To the archaeologists, these were invaluable scientific specimens, but to the living indigenous peoples, this was a profound desecration, a violation of their spiritual beliefs, and a painful continuation of the trauma inflicted upon their ancestors. The passage of legislation like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, in the United States in 1990 marked a monumental shift. This law established a legal process for the return of these cultural items to federally recognized tribes. The implementation of NAGPRA has been complex and sometimes contentious, but its principle is clear. The voices and beliefs of descendant communities must be central to the decision-making process. It acknowledges that a scientific understanding of an object is not the only valid understanding. A ritual mask is not just a piece of wood, it is a living, sacred being. A skeleton is not just a source of DNA data, it is a grandmother or a grandfather who deserves to rest in peace. This represents a fundamental rebalancing of power, giving indigenous peoples the authority to control their own heritage and tell their own stories. This directly impacts the interpretation of the very myths we seek to recover. Imagine if a text were discovered that contained a creation story sacred to a living indigenous culture. Who has the right to read it, to translate it, to publish its contents for the world? A Western academic might see an invaluable historical document, a key to understanding human belief systems. But for the community to whom the story belongs, its power may depend on its secrecy, on its being shared only with initiated elders at specific times of the year. Making it public could, from their perspective, strip it of its sacredness and violate spiritual protocols. This is not a hypothetical scenario. It echoes real debates over the publication of photographs of secret sacred Aboriginal Australian sites or the recording of rituals meant only for certain eyes and ears. The ethical archaeologist or historian today must navigate these waters with immense respect and humility, often prioritizing the wishes of the living culture over the academic impulse to share all knowledge freely. It requires a partnership, a collaboration where the community are not subjects of study but equal partners in the research. These ethical considerations are not a hindrance to archaeology, they are its necessary evolution. They remind us that the past does not exist in a vacuum. It is intimately connected to the present through living people who have a deep, often spiritual, stake in how it is handled. The recovery of a lost myth is no longer just an intellectual puzzle to be solved by experts in distant universities. It is a process that must be undertaken with cultural sensitivity, a recognition of historical wrongs, and a commitment to ethical stewardship. The goal is no longer simply to extract knowledge, but to facilitate a conversation between the past and the present, and between different cultures in the present, about the meaning and ownership of our shared human story. This more thoughtful, collaborative approach ensures that the incredible power of these rediscovered narratives serves to heal and connect, rather than to repeat the patterns of appropriation and exclusion that have too often marred the history of archaeology itself. This journey into the nature of mythic suppression now leads us to the soaring peaks of the Persian plateau, to a religious tradition that has defined one of history's most powerful and enduring cosmic ideas, the eternal struggle between light and darkness. Zoroastrianism, the faith of the ancient Achaemenid and Sasanian empires, presents a universe born from a fundamental, irreconcilable division. From the very beginning, the benevolent, all-wise god Ahura Mazda is locked in a cosmic war with his adversarial opposite, Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit of chaos and falsehood. This is a worldview of clear choices, of ultimate consequences, where every human thought and action is a contribution to one side or the other in a battle that will culminate in a final, fiery judgment. It is a compelling, dramatic narrative that has influenced countless other belief systems. But what if this foundational dualism was not the original vision? The discovery of a fragile text preserved in the dry, cool darkness of a remote mountain temple suggests that Persia's spiritual ancestors imagined a far more complex and cooperative beginning. The text itself is written in a dialect older than the Avestan of the Zoroastrian canon, and its material inscribed on prepared animal hide places it in a time before the reforms of the prophet Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, became the state religion. This pre-Zoroastrian narrative describes a moment before time, a state of pure potential where the two fundamental forces of existence are not yet distinct personalities, not yet enemies. They are presented as complementary principles, perhaps akin to the philosophical concepts of being and non-being, or order and energy. In this primordial state, they exist in a dynamic, creative tension, not a destructive conflict. The myth uses a beautiful, profound metaphor. They are like two great artists standing before a blank canvas, each possessing unique and essential skills. One holds the vision for magnificent, enduring structures, the mountains, the stars, the cycles of day and night. The other possesses the raw, unbounded energy and the countless potential forms needed to bring that vision into reality. In this initial act of creation, they are partners. They agree to collaborate, to pool their distinct natures to fashion a universe that is both stable and vibrant, both structured and free. According to this recovered account, the world they build together is a masterpiece of balance. The text describes a cosmos where light needs shadow to give it definition, where growth requires the possibility of decay to make way for new life, where the rigidity of law is tempered by the spontaneity of creativity. It is a system designed to be a self-sustaining whole, where the two principles are meant to be in a constant, productive dialogue, each checking and complementing the other. The conflict, the myth explains, did not arise from an inherent evil in one of the partners. Instead, it was born from a catastrophic misunderstanding, a tragic failure of communication. One of the principles, perhaps the one associated with boundless energy and change, began to perceive the structures and laws created by its partner not as a necessary framework for existence, but as a form of imprisonment. It started to see limits where there were meant to be foundations, to see order as oppression. This growing misinterpretation festered into resentment, and that resentment finally erupted as rebellion. The cooperative project was shattered, and the balanced system fractured into the two opposing camps we recognize from Zoroastrian orthodoxy. The Great Cosmic War began not because one side was fundamentally evil, but because of a breakdown in the perception of a shared purpose. This nuanced origin story has the power to completely rewrite the rules of Persian dualism. The familiar Zoroastrian model is linear and teleological. It has a clear beginning, a long middle of struggle, and a definitive, victorious end. It is a story of purification, of the ultimate triumph of good over evil. The older myth, however, presents a cyclical and tragic vision. It suggests that the conflict we experience is not the natural state of the universe, but a fallen condition, a corruption of an original harmony. The ultimate goal, then, might not be the utter annihilation of one principle by the other, but a difficult, perhaps messianic, reconciliation. It reframes the human condition. Instead of being soldiers in a war with a predetermined outcome, our role becomes that of mediators, of healers. Our ethical duty is to recognize the value of both structure and freedom, both tradition and innovation, within our own lives and societies, and to work towards restoring the balance that was lost through that ancient misunderstanding. The implications for the history of religious thought are profound. For a long time, scholars have often posited a linear evolution in theology, from simple, animistic beliefs to more complex polytheisms, and finally to the sophisticated dualistic or monotheistic systems that emphasize moral absolutes. The discovery of this pre-Zoroastrian text turns that assumption on its head. It reveals that an earlier, pre-literate or less centralized Persian culture had already arrived at a highly sophisticated, almost philosophical understanding of cosmic duality as an integrated, cooperative system. The later Zoroastrian reform, which simplified this complex relationship into a stark good versus evil dichotomy, might not represent an advancement in theological complexity, but rather a strategic simplification. This sharper, more dramatic narrative would have been incredibly powerful for uniting a vast empire under a single, clear moral code. It provided a compelling ideology for the Persian kings, who could position themselves as the champions of Ahura Mazda against the forces of darkness, both spiritual and political. The older, more ambiguous myth, with its message of balance and reconciliation, may have been less useful for mobilizing an imperial army and was therefore marginalized, surviving only in isolated communities far from the centers of power. This challenges the very notion of religious progress, suggesting that what becomes the orthodox tradition is often not the most philosophically complex, but the most politically effective version of the truth. And so we arrive at a point where the humanist's quest for meaning meets the scientist's demand for data. Deciphering the words on a scroll is a monumental achievement, but it only tells us part of the story. The text itself is a message from the past, but the physical object that carries that message, the papyrus, the parchment, the ink, holds secrets of its own, a hidden biography that can only be read with the tools of modern science. This is where the collaboration between the laboratory and the library begins, a partnership that allows us to interrogate these ancient artifacts in ways their creators could never have imagined. We are no longer just reading the words, we are asking the very molecules of the scroll to testify, to tell us when it was made, where it came from, and even the journey it took before being sealed in a jar or buried in a tomb. This scientific analysis acts as the ultimate fact-checker for history, providing an objective reality that can confirm, challenge, or profoundly enrich the narrative contained within the text. One of the most fundamental questions we can ask is also the most straightforward. How old is it? For this, we turn to a revolutionary technique known as radiocarbon dating. This method relies on a simple, elegant natural clock. All living things absorb carbon from the atmosphere, including a tiny, unstable fraction known as carbon-14. When a plant or animal dies, it stops absorbing new carbon, and the carbon-14 it contains begins to decay at a very steady, predictable rate. By measuring the minuscule amount of this isotope left in a sample of papyrus or a fragment of parchment, scientists can calculate how long ago the flax plant was harvested or the animal was slaughtered. This gives us a reliable date for the creation of the writing material itself, anchoring the text in a specific window of time. It's a powerful tool for authentication. If a scroll claims to be from the time of Emperor Augustus, but its papyrus dates to the medieval period, we know we are dealing with a forgery. More importantly, it allows us to place previously unknown works precisely within the historical timeline. A myth with no author or clear historical references can be firmly situated in, say, the 2nd century BC, allowing historians to ask new questions about why it might have been written at that particular moment of political change or cultural fusion. But what if the text on the page has literally vanished, faded to a faint brown stain indistinguishable from the aged papyrus itself? This is a common tragedy where priceless writings are rendered unreadable by time. Here, science performs what can only be described as a miracle of recovery through a technology called multispectral imaging. This process involves photographing the scroll under different wavelengths of light, far beyond the narrow spectrum visible to the human eye. We might use ultraviolet light, which can cause certain faded inks to fluoresce, or infrared light, which can penetrate the surface stain to reveal the carbon-based ink underneath. Each wavelength interacts differently with the chemical composition of the ink and the writing surface. A sophisticated camera then captures these interactions, and powerful computer algorithms combine the images, enhancing the contrast between the ink and the background. Text that is completely invisible to the naked eye can suddenly leap into sharp, readable clarity on a computer screen. This technique has brought entire libraries back from the brink of oblivion, allowing us to read philosophical texts from carbonized scrolls at Herculaneum and reclaim gospels from palimpsests where they had been scraped away. It is a form of technological time travel, giving us a second chance to see what was once thought lost forever. Perhaps the most intimate level of analysis comes from the field of genetics. When we hold a parchment manuscript, we are holding the processed skin of an animal that lived 2,000 years ago. Today, scientists can extract trace amounts of DNA from that parchment. This genetic material is a treasure trove of information. First, it can tell us exactly what species of animal was used to make the parchment. Was it a calf, a sheep, or a goat? This isn't just trivial detail. It can reveal trade routes and economic practices. The preference for a specific animal in a particular region or time period can help pinpoint a manuscript's origin. Furthermore, by analyzing the mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, researchers can sometimes determine the genetic diversity of the herd the animal came from. A lack of diversity might suggest a controlled, monastic breeding program, while high diversity could indicate a manuscript was produced in a major urban center drawing from a wide market. In the future, this genetic data might even allow us to map the geographic movement of herds, tracing the journey of the raw material from farm to scriptorium. We are, in effect, reading the biography of the animal whose skin became the vessel for a myth, adding a deeply personal, biological layer to the history of the book. All of these scientific techniques, the atomic clock of radiocarbon dating, the revelatory light of multispectral imaging, and the biological story told by DNA, converge to create a multi-dimensional portrait of an ancient text. They move us beyond the realm of interpretation and into the realm of verification. When a myth describes a great flood, geological core samples can tell us if there was a catastrophic inundation in that region around the time the papyrus was made. When a text mentions a specific king previously known only from legend, carbon dating can confirm that the manuscript is indeed from his era, lending powerful support to his historical existence. Science provides the hard scaffolding upon which we can more confidently hang the intricate tapestries of literature and myth. It is the crucial collaboration that ensures our stories about the past are not just compelling, but are grounded in the physical evidence of the world those stories describe. This partnership transforms history from a collection of intriguing tales into a robust, evidence-based understanding of human civilization, where every word is supported by the silent, powerful testimony of the atoms that preserve it. This concept of a sacred yet adaptable law brings us to the oldest continuous culture on Earth, a civilization whose understanding of time and tradition challenges our most fundamental assumptions. When European colonists first encountered Aboriginal Australian cultures, they often made a critical mistake. They observed the intricate rituals, the complex kinship systems, and the ancient stories of the dreaming, and they labeled it all as static, unchanging, and timeless. They saw a people living in what they perceived as a state of primordial arrest, their traditions frozen in amber. But this was a profound misunderstanding, one that ignored the deep, dynamic philosophy encoded within the very myths they were trying to document. Among the stories recorded by early anthropologists, sometimes faithfully, sometimes through a distorted lens, we find a narrative that shatters this illusion of permanence. It is a dreamtime story that doesn't just describe the creation of the world, but explicitly details its ongoing recreation, a myth about the time the ancestral beings themselves decided to change the rules. The dreaming or dream time is not a distant, finished event in the Aboriginal worldview. It is the eternal, living reality that underpins the visible world, a time of creation that is always present. The ancestral beings who shaped the landscape, the rainbow serpent, the kangaroo man, the wagtail sisters, did not simply vanish after their work was done. Their creative power and the laws they established continue to resonate through the land. For generations, the responsibility of humanity has been to maintain this sacred order through ceremony, story, and a respectful way of life. This is often interpreted as a mandate for strict, unchanging conservatism, but the myth of the changing law reveals a far more sophisticated relationship between the eternal dreaming and the flowing river of human time. The story tells of a period when people, through their own ingenuity, invented a new and revolutionary tool. Perhaps it was a new type of boomerang with a more accurate flight, a novel fish trap that dramatically increased a community's catch, or a new technique for grinding seeds that created a more nutritious flour. This innovation was so significant that it altered the very rhythm of daily life, changing how people related to the land and to each other. In most traditional narratives, such a disruption of the established order might be met with divine punishment, a warning against human hubris. But in this story, the ancestral beings respond differently. They observe this human invention not with anger, but with curiosity and a kind of divine pragmatism. They see that the old laws, the protocols established at the beginning of time, are no longer perfectly aligned with this new human reality. The existing rules might lead to an imbalance, perhaps overhunting if the new tool is too effective, or social conflict over the new resources it provides. So the ancestors convene. They enter into a new period of deliberation, a fresh chapter of the dreaming, and they make a momentous decision. They alter the law itself. They introduce new rituals to govern the use of the new tool. They adjust the song lines, the spiritual pathways that crisscross the continent, to account for the changed human footprint on the land. They might even transform themselves slightly, taking on new aspects that reflect the new relationship between people and the environment. The fundamental sacredness of the world remains, but the specific regulations that maintain its balance are updated. This is a breathtakingly dynamic cosmology. It presents a universe where the sacred is not a rigid set of commandments carved in stone, but a living, responsive system. The law is not something merely to be obeyed. It is something to be continuously negotiated through a dialogue between the human community and the enduring creative power of the dreaming. Human innovation is not seen as a threat to tradition, but as a potential catalyst for its evolution. This myth encodes a profound philosophical insight that for a system to be truly sustainable over millennia, it must possess a built-in capacity for adaptation. It recognizes that change is the only constant, and that wisdom lies not in resisting change, but in guiding it with reverence and responsibility. The elders and knowledge keepers within Aboriginal societies were not just preservers of a static past, they were the interpreters of this living law, tasked with understanding how new circumstances required new applications of ancient principles. This narrative completely rewrites the rules of how we view so-called timeless traditions. The strength of Aboriginal culture lies not in an unchanging repetition of the past, but in its resilient ability to incorporate change within a framework of eternal connection to country. It is a tradition that has managed to be both deeply conservative in its unwavering commitment to the dreaming and remarkably progressive in its acceptance that the expressions of that commitment must evolve. This challenges the very stereotype of indigenous cultures as being past-oriented and resistant to change. Instead, it reveals a worldview that has successfully navigated 60,000 years of dramatic climatic shifts and social transformations precisely because it was not rigid. It was a system designed for resilience, built on the understanding that the law, like the land itself, is a living entity requiring careful stewardship and, when necessary, respectful renewal. The recovery of this myth, even from the imperfect records of early observers, forces us to see the deep history of Australia not as a museum diorama, but as a vibrant, ongoing conversation between the people and the timeless world they have always called home. There's a profound and almost unsettling feeling that accompanies the rediscovery of a lost myth, a sensation that goes far beyond simple historical curiosity. It's a psychological tremor, a sense of encountering something simultaneously alien and deeply familiar. Why does the story of a Sumerian god earning power through innovation, or a Celtic king validated by the land itself, strike such a resonant chord with us in the 21st century? The answer lies in the fact that these narratives are not just relics. They are mirrors reflecting the perennial struggles and questions of the human condition. When we recover a forgotten story, it can feel like healing a deep cultural wound we didn't even know we had, or like finding a critical missing piece in the vast, complex puzzle of our own identity. These myths speak to universal, timeless themes: the thirst for justice, the nature of legitimate power, the mystery of creation, and the fundamental need to belong, but they do so from a perspective that has been silenced, offering a viewpoint that challenges the assumptions we've inherited. Consider the theme of power. Our modern world is saturated with political models that often feel inevitable, from partisan democracies to authoritarian states. We are taught a certain linear history of governance, a progression toward our current systems. But then we unearth the Egyptian myth where the pharaoh's authority hinges on the approval of a powerful goddess. Suddenly, the idea of divine right, of automatic male succession, is revealed not as a universal law but as one contested option among others. This doesn't mean we should adopt that specific myth as a political blueprint, but it powerfully demonstrates that our current structures are not the only way human societies have imagined organizing themselves. It injects a crucial dose of imagination into our political thinking. It whispers that alternatives are possible, that the rules we live by were invented and can therefore be reinvented. This is psychologically liberating. It breaks the spell of inevitability that can make contemporary political problems feel unsolvable. On a more personal level, these stories can address profound existential anxieties. The Norse prophecy of a peaceful world after Ragnarök, for instance, offers a powerful alternative to our culture's often bleak and fatalistic view of endings. We are surrounded by narratives of apocalyptic collapse, from climate change forecasts to dystopian fiction, which can lead to a sense of helplessness. The Norse vision, however, suggests that destruction can be a precursor to a more just and wise renewal. It's a narrative not of finality, but of resilience and hope. For an individual feeling overwhelmed by the crises of the modern world, this ancient myth provides a different psychological framework. It suggests that our efforts to build a better society, no matter how small, are part of a cosmic pattern of recovery, not a futile struggle against an inevitable doom. It replaces despair with a sense of purpose, anchoring our present actions in a grand, cyclical story of death and rebirth. Furthermore, these rediscovered narratives can act as a form of collective therapy, especially for cultures that have suffered historical trauma, colonization, or the deliberate erasure of their heritage. The recovery of a Mesoamerican codex, for example, is not just an academic victory for archaeologists. For the descendant communities of the Maya or Aztec people, it is a reclamation of identity. It is a voice from their own ancestors, speaking directly to them after centuries of being told that their history was primitive, their gods demonic, and their stories worthless. To have a myth like that of the dual-souled hero restored is to have a piece of their soul returned. It validates their worldview, their connection to the land, and their philosophical sophistication. This psychological impact is immeasurable. It fosters pride, resilience, and a healing sense of cultural continuity that counteracts the damaging narratives imposed by conquerors. The act of rediscovery itself is a potent metaphor for our own personal journeys. We all have parts of ourselves that we suppress, memories we bury, or potentials we ignore in order to conform to the expectations of family, society, or our own internal critics. The process of unearthing a lost myth, the careful brushing away of dust, the patient piecing together of fragments, the slow decipherment of a forgotten language parallels the work of psychotherapy and self-discovery. It is a testament to the idea that what is hidden is not necessarily gone, and that wholeness can be achieved by integrating lost or rejected parts of ourselves. Just as a civilization becomes richer and more complex when it recovers a suppressed chapter of its past, an individual becomes more complete when they have the courage to uncover and embrace their own buried stories. These ancient tales remind us that the quest for self-knowledge is an ancient and sacred one. Ultimately, the power of these narratives lies in their ability to expand our collective imagination. They are like a software update for the human psyche, adding new options to the menu of how we can think about our world. The Aboriginal Australian myth of the changing law, which portrays the sacred order as adaptable to human innovation, offers a revolutionary model for reconciling tradition with progress. In an era torn between rigid fundamentalism and rootless modernity, this ancient story suggests a third path, a dynamic, living tradition that evolves through a respectful dialogue with change. It provides a new old way of seeing our relationship with the environment, with technology, and with each other. By listening to these long-lost voices, we are not escaping into the past. We are foraging in the vast attic of human experience for tools and ideas that can help us build a more thoughtful, balanced, and imaginative future. The recovery of a myth is an act of hope, a belief that the answers we need today might have been imagined in some form long ago. Now, let us set sail for the sun-drenched island of Crete, to a civilization that has captivated and perplexed historians for over a century, the Minoans. The image we have is one of breathtaking elegance and apparent peace, a world of airy palaces with intricate labyrinths, vibrant frescoes of leaping dolphins and graceful bull dancers, and a complete absence of any obvious fortifications. This portrait, largely painted by the early archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans, who excavated Knossos, suggested a uniquely peaceful, almost utopian society, a thalassocracy or sea empire, built on trade and cultural influence rather than conquest. But in recent decades, scholars have begun to question this idyllic picture. Is the lack of obvious defensive walls proof of peace, or simply a confidence in naval power? Could the vibrant art be a mask for a more complex and perhaps violent reality? The evidence is frustratingly scarce and open to interpretation, leaving the true nature of Minoan power as one of the great enigmas of the Bronze Age. This is where the search for a lost myth becomes not just an academic exercise, but a desperate attempt to hear the Minoans speak for themselves. Their language, Linear A, remains undeciphered, a silent script etched onto clay tablets that hold the secrets of their administration, their economy, and possibly their sacred stories. Without a Rosetta Stone for Linear A, we are left with what they built and what they painted. But what if we have been looking at these images with the wrong set of assumptions? A radical reinterpretation of the most iconic Minoan art is now suggesting a narrative, a potential myth of power that could rewrite our understanding of how a civilization can rise to greatness. This is not a myth found on a scroll, but one pieced together from the fragments of frescoes and the impressions left on small, carved seal stones, objects used to mark ownership and authority. Central to this reinterpretation is the famous and often misunderstood bull-leaping fresco from Knossos, We have long seen this as a depiction of a dangerous sport or acrobatic ritual. But look closer, the scene is not one of chaotic struggle. It is a masterpiece of coordinated movement and precise timing. The leaper, often depicted with a distinctive wasp waist and flowing hair, is not fighting the bull but engaging with it in a highly stylized, almost choreographed interaction. This is not a celebration of brute force over a wild animal, but a demonstration of grace, courage, and perfect harmony with a powerful natural force. Now extend this metaphor to the concept of rulership. What if this image is not just a scene from a ceremony, but a symbolic representation of the Minoan ideal of power? The monarch, like the leaper, does not dominate through violence. Instead, they master the art of mediation, of navigating powerful, potentially destructive forces, be they rival cities, natural disasters, or economic rivals, with agility, timing, and breathtaking skill. Their authority is demonstrated not by a pile of enemy skulls, but by their ability to perform the ultimate political dance, turning confrontation into a spectacle of balance and control. This theme of ritual mastery over conflict is echoed in other artifacts. Numerous seal stones show a central, larger figure, often interpreted as a ruler or a goddess, sitting serenely, flanked by two griffins or other mythical beasts. These creatures are not subdued or slain. They are symmetrically arranged, facing the central figure in a posture that suggests not submission, but reverence and guardianship. This image powerfully evokes the idea of a pacifist monarch as a mediator. The ruler's power lies in their ability to sit at the center of opposing forces, to tame the wild and chaotic elements of the world not by crushing them, but by integrating them into a harmonious, balanced whole. They resolve conflicts not on the battlefield, but in the sacred space of the palace courtyard or the temple, through ceremony, diplomacy, and the compelling power of ritual spectacle. If this interpretation holds, it presents a dramatic challenge to the dominant model of state formation in the ancient world. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, the archetype is the warrior king. The pharaoh smites his enemies, the Sumerian king leads his armies into battle. Their legitimacy is inextricably linked to their prowess as war leaders. This narrative suggests that complex, hierarchical societies simply cannot emerge without the centralizing force of organized violence. The Minoan model, as inferred from this potential myth, offers a stunning alternative, an Aegean path to complexity. Here, the engine of state formation is not warfare, but economic and cultural prowess. The Minoan palaces were not military headquarters. They were redistributive centers for a vast trade network that stretched from Cyprus to Sardinia. They were factories for producing exquisite goods, from perfumed oil to intricate pottery, that were desired across the Mediterranean. In this light, the Minoan monarch was not a warlord, but a master merchant and a high priest. Their power was derived from their control over lucrative trade routes, their ability to organize skilled artisans, and their role as the chief intermediary with the gods, ensuring the fertility and safety of the sea lanes. Their wealth allowed them to patronize the arts, to build monumental structures without defensive walls as a statement of confidence and influence, and to create a culture so attractive that their neighbors, like the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, eagerly adopted Minoan styles and symbols. The myth of the pacifist monarch, then, is the story of a state built on soft power. It suggests that under the right conditions, control of key resources, a commanding position in trade networks, and a sophisticated religious ideology, a society can achieve remarkable complexity by excelling in the arts of peace. The ruler's most important weapon is not a sword, but a ship. Their most valued ally is not a soldier, but a diplomat. The discovery of such a narrative would force us to expand our narrow definitions of power and acknowledge that the currents of commerce and culture can be just as formative as the clash of armies. But what if the wheel of history had turned just slightly differently? We have been exploring how these lost myths reshape our understanding of the past, but their true power might lie in how they allow us to reimagine the future, or rather, the futures that were once possible. This is the realm of counterfactual history, a thought experiment that uses mythology not as a record of what was, but as a key to unlocking what could have been. Every dominant myth that shaped an ancient civilization was in essence a choice. It was one version of reality selected for promotion, while other competing narratives were marginalized, forgotten, or destroyed. By recovering those lost alternatives, we are not just filling in blanks. We are reopening doors that were closed centuries ago, doors leading to entirely different paths of human development. Let's take a concrete example. Imagine for a moment that the Egyptian myth of the goddess challenged Pharaoh, the one where the king's power must be validated by a powerful feminine deity like Sekhmet, had not been hidden away in a neglected tomb. What if instead it had become the foundational text of the new kingdom, taught in every temple and recited at every coronation? The entire theological framework of kingship would have been transformed. The pharaoh would still be the son of Ra, but his authority would now be conditional, dependent on his ability to demonstrate wisdom and justice to a divine maternal authority. This would have created a permanent, institutionalized role for powerful women at the very heart of the state. The queen mother or the chief royal wife would not be merely an influential advisor. She would be the recognized earthly embodiment of the goddess, the essential intercessor without whom the pharaoh's claim to the throne would be theologically incomplete. Consider the ripple effects. A new kingdom guided by this myth might have seen a long line of female co-rulers wielding power as a sacred right, not as an exception like Hatshepsut. Political culture might have valued negotiation and the upholding of Maat or cosmic balance over pure military conquest. Perhaps the aggressive, expansionist campaigns of a pharaoh like Ramesses II would have been viewed as a failure of this divine contract, a sign that he was ruling through brute force rather than sacred balance. The entire relationship with neighboring powers could have been different, based more on diplomacy and reciprocity than on intimidation. The art and architecture of the period would reflect this duality, with goddess imagery standing equal to that of the sun god in scale and prominence. This alternate Egypt would be a civilization where power was fundamentally shared, its legitimacy constantly tested against a standard of justice and balance, creating a society that might have been more stable, more inclusive, and profoundly different from the one we know from the historical record. This exercise is not mere fantasy. It highlights the immense, tangible power of narrative. The stories a culture tells about itself are not passive entertainment. They are active blueprints for reality. They shape laws, justify social structures, define ethical boundaries, and inspire collective action. A myth that champions the engineer king who tames floods, like the one from ancient China, will produce a society that invests heavily in public works and values bureaucratic competence. A myth that glorifies the warrior king who smites his enemies will produce a society that celebrates military prowess and expansion. The dominant narrative sets the priorities, channels the resources, and molds the very identity of a civilization. When we recover a lost myth, we are therefore recovering a lost blueprint, a discarded plan for building a society. We are glimpsing an alternate reality that was once a live option, a future that was actively imagined and perhaps even advocated for by a significant portion of the population. This perspective forces us to confront the unsettling fact that our present world is built upon a very specific and very narrow selection of ancient stories. The concepts of hierarchy, conquest, and patriarchal authority that have dominated so much of history were not inevitable. They were reinforced and perpetuated by the myths that the most powerful institutions chose to preserve and promote. The lost myths we've uncovered: the Sumerian tale of merit, the Celtic contract with the land, the Minoan ideal of ritual mastery, reveal that there were always other ways to imagine power, other models for leadership, other visions of humanity's relationship with the cosmos. Their suppression ensured that certain ideas never got the chance to flourish on a grand scale. The path we are on today is the result of that ancient winnowing process. Therefore, the recovery of these narratives does more than satisfy historical curiosity. It enriches our imagination for the future. By showing us that the present was not preordained, it reveals that the future is not fixed. The same power of story that shaped the ancient world is at work in our own time. The political ideologies, the economic theories, the social movements that define our era are all, in a sense, modern myths, competing narratives about who we are and what we should value. Understanding that these narratives are choices, not inevitabilities, is incredibly empowering. It reminds us that we are not passive passengers on a predetermined historical trajectory. We are participants in an ongoing process of storytelling, with the ability to question the dominant narratives of our time and to champion alternative visions, just as those ancient scribes and storytellers did. The lost myths of the past offer us a toolkit of forgotten ideas, a reservoir of alternative possibilities that can inspire us to think more creatively and more critically about the stories we choose to tell ourselves today, and the kind of world we want those stories to build for tomorrow. Of all the great civilizations of the ancient world, the Indus Valley presents the most profound and tantalizing silence. Flourishing for centuries across what is now Pakistan and northwest India, its cities, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, were marvels of urban planning with sophisticated drainage systems, standardized bricks, and vast granaries. Yet, despite leaving behind thousands of inscriptions on small, intricately carved stone seals, their voice has been completely lost to us. Their script, a collection of elegant but enigmatic symbols, remains undeciphered, defying every attempt at translation. It is a civilization with magnificent architecture but no known kings, with abundant artifacts but no deciphered poetry or prayers. This silence forces us to become archaeological detectives of a different sort. Without a Rosetta Stone to provide a key, we must learn to read a different kind of text, one written not in words, but in images, symbols, and patterns repeated across hundreds of artifacts. It is here, in the silent language of iconography, that we might just discern the ghost of a lost myth. The most compelling clues come from the famous Indus Valley seals. These small, square soapstone tablets, carved with remarkable skill, were likely used for stamping impressions onto clay or wax to mark property and goods. What's astonishing is their consistency. Across a vast territory and over hundreds of years, the same handful of motifs appear again and again. The most common of these is the image of a single, stocky, bull-like animal, always depicted in profile with one distinctive, impossible feature: a single, carefully drawn horn protruding from its forehead. This is the so-called unicorn of the Indus, and it is far from a random decorative element. It appears on the majority of surviving seals, almost always in the same pose, standing before a mysterious object that archaeologists call a standard or a ritual manger. This object, which looks like a large, spouted funnel or a censer, is placed between the unicorn and what might be a divine or priestly figure. The repetition is too deliberate, too standardized to be mere coincidence. This is not just art, it is a message. Some researchers now propose that we are not looking at isolated symbols, but at frozen frames from a well-known story, a symbolic narrative that everyone in that civilization would have instantly recognized. If we dare to read these images as a sequence, a possible myth begins to emerge. The central scene appears to depict a moment of ritual offering or sacred communion. The unicorn, rather than being a fearsome beast of combat, is portrayed as calm, powerful, and dignified. It is not being hunted or slain like the lions in Mesopotamian royal seals. It is being presented to, or perhaps receiving an offering from, a human-like figure. This figure is often small, perhaps indicating its distance or its different nature, and is sometimes shown in a posture that could be interpreted as reverence or adoration. The standard or manger between them acts as the focal point of the interaction, a vessel for a liquid offering or a source of sacred sustenance. The entire composition radiates not conflict or domination, but a sense of solemn ceremony, of a peaceful exchange between the human and animal, or perhaps the mortal and divine realms. This hypothesized narrative, pieced together from scattered images, suggests a religious worldview that stands in stark contrast to those of its contemporaries. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, the foundational myths that justified state power were overwhelmingly about conquest and hierarchy. The pharaoh smites his enemies, the god Marduk defeats the chaos monster Tiamat and creates the world from her corpse. Kingship is established through violent victory over rivals. The Indus Valley seals tell a different story. Here, the central theme seems to be not conquest but sustenance, not domination but guardianship. The myth appears to revolve around a sacred contract of provision and protection. The unicorn, as a powerful, mythical beast, might represent the fertile, untamed forces of nature, while the ritual offering signifies humanity's role in maintaining a balance with those forces through respectful ceremony. The goal is not to subdue nature, but to enter into a reciprocal relationship with it, ensuring the continued fertility of the land and the well-being of the community. This has profound implications for our understanding of Indus Valley society. A civilization whose core myth is about sustenance and guardianship would logically be structured very differently from one whose core myth is about divine kingship and military triumph. The sheer absence of any evidence for grandiose royal palaces, massive temples, or monumental statues of warrior kings in the Indus cities suddenly makes sense. Instead, their greatest architectural achievements are practical and collective: city-wide water systems, large granaries for storing surplus grain, and standardized houses that suggest a remarkable degree of social equality. Power in the Indus Valley may not have been concentrated in the hands of a single, glorified ruler, but vested in a class of priestly administrators or merchant guilds whose authority was based on their ability to manage resources, oversee trade, and perform the rituals that ensured the community's survival. Their legitimacy came from their role as guardians of the sacred contract, as the facilitators of the offering to the unicorn, not from their prowess in battle. This silent narrative, etched on countless seals, offers us a glimpse of a uniquely structured society, one that found a path to complexity without the glorification of the warrior king, building its greatness on a foundation of collective well-being and a profound reverence for the sources of life itself. And so, after this incredible journey through myths recovered and worlds remade, we are left with the most thrilling question of all: what still lies hidden? The work of unearthing the past is far from finished. In fact, we are standing at the dawn of its most exciting chapter. The age of the lone archaeologist with a brush and a lucky guess is being transformed into an era of high-tech collaboration, where particle accelerators and artificial intelligence are becoming the newest and most powerful tools in our quest. The next great discovery might not come from a farmer's wayward hoe, but from a scientist analyzing data in a lab halfway around the world from where the artifact was found. The potential hiding places for lost knowledge are as vast as they are tantalizing. Consider the Valley of the Kings in Egypt. For over a century, we've believed we've found all its major tombs. Yet, recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed tantalizing anomalies, voids, and chambers deep within the bedrock that no modern human has ever entered. Could one of these be an untouched royal cache, sealed during a time of crisis and forgotten for 3,000 years, its walls lined with papyrus scrolls containing the complete sacred texts of a forgotten pharaoh? The very possibility sends a shiver down the spine of every Egyptologist. Then there are the known sites that almost certainly hold more secrets. The caves near the Dead Sea, where the famous scrolls were found, are part of a vast, rugged limestone cliff face. Expeditions continue to explore every crevice, and the discovery of even a single new cave, perhaps one used by a different sect than the Essenes, could yield a library that completely reshapes our understanding of Second Temple Judaism. Similarly, the caves of Dunhuang in China, which gave us the astonishing Diamond Sutra and thousands of other manuscripts, hint at the sheer scale of what might still be concealed in the world's remote places. But the future is not just about finding new physical locations. It is about unlocking the treasures we already have but cannot yet read. The charred, carbonized scrolls from the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum are the perfect example. For centuries, they were considered little more than lumps of charcoal, their contents hopelessly lost. Attempts to unroll them physically destroyed them. But now, a global scientific effort, the Vesuvius Challenge, is using a revolutionary technique. By taking incredibly high-resolution, three-dimensional X-ray scans of the scrolls using a particle accelerator, researchers have created a digital map of the internal structure, down to the texture of the papyrus fibers and the microscopic bumps of the ink. The challenge now is to train artificial intelligence algorithms to virtually unroll these scans and distinguish the faint traces of carbon-based ink from the carbonized papyrus itself. It is a monumental task of digital archaeology, and the first successful readings of complete words and phrases from these scrolls have just been announced. A breakthrough that promises to recover entire libraries of lost Greek and Latin philosophy from the ashes of Vesuvius. This fusion of physics and computing is being applied on an even grander scale. Projects are now underway to use cosmic ray muon tomography to scan the Great Pyramids of Egypt. Muons are subatomic particles that rain down from the atmosphere and can pass through solid rock, but are absorbed at different rates depending on the density of the material they traverse. By placing muon detectors inside known chambers of a pyramid, scientists can create a three-dimensional density map of the entire structure, potentially revealing hidden rooms or passages that have eluded detection for 4,500 years. Imagine a scenario where such a scan reveals a sealed chamber within the Great Pyramid, not a tomb filled with gold, but a library, a time capsule left by its builders containing the original architectural plans and the religious texts that guided its construction. The myths encoded in those texts would be the ultimate key to understanding the pyramid's true purpose. Beyond reading the unreadable, technology is poised to crack the ultimate codes. The world's remaining undeciphered scripts like Linear are from the Minoans or the Rongorongo script of Easter Island have resisted all traditional methods. But artificial intelligence is now being trained on the patterns of these scripts, comparing them to the structures of known languages and looking for statistical regularities that might indicate grammatical rules or common words. An AI doesn't get tired or frustrated. It can run millions of simulations, testing different hypotheses for phonetic values or logographic meanings. It could cross-reference the symbols on a Minoan tablet with the database of known Minoan art and artifacts, searching for contextual clues that a human might miss. The first AI-assisted decipherment of a major ancient script is not a matter of if, but when, and it will open a window onto a civilization that has been utterly silent for 3 millennia. The future of myth discovery, therefore, is a partnership between human intuition and machine intelligence, between the daring of the excavator and the precision of the particle physicist. We are no longer limited to what we can physically dig up. We can now peer through stone, digitally reconstruct shattered pottery, and listen for the whispers of language in patterns invisible to the naked eye. The coming decades promise a flood of new voices from the past, each one holding the potential to challenge another pillar of history. The quest for lost myths is entering a golden age, driven by a global community of scholars, scientists, and citizen enthusiasts, all connected by a shared passion for recovering the stories that define us. The next great discovery could be announced tomorrow, and it might just rewrite the rules of another ancient civilization, reminding us once again that the final chapter of history is never truly written. And so, as we reach the end of this journey through buried archives and resurrected stories, we are left with a profound and humbling realization. The history we think we know is not a solid, unshakable monument, but something far more fluid and fascinating. It is a palimpsest, a parchment where the official narrative is written boldly on the surface, but where the faint, ghostly traces of alternative truths still linger just beneath, waiting for the light of discovery to bring them back into view. Each of these lost myths we have encountered, from the Sumerian gods who earned their power through innovation to the Celtic king whose right to rule was granted by the land itself, was far more than a simple tale. They were powerful, living blueprints for how a society could be organized. They challenged the absolute authority of kings, redefined the very essence of leadership, and presented worldviews of stunning complexity that offered different paths humanity could have taken. This recovery of lost voices is not just an academic exercise, it is a masterclass in intellectual humility. It forces us to acknowledge that our understanding of the ancient world is, and always will be, a work in progress, perpetually incomplete. For every scroll we unroll, there are 1,000 more that have crumbled to dust. For every myth we decipher, there are countless others whose echoes have faded into silence. This is not a cause for despair, but for wonder. It means that the past remains an open book, with new chapters being discovered all the time, each one capable of overturning our most cherished assumptions. The certainty we often feel about the past is an illusion. The reality is a vibrant, ongoing conversation across the centuries, a dialogue between what was preserved and what was almost lost. Let these remarkable stories serve as an inspiration for your own life in the present. They should ignite a curious and questioning spirit within you. Take a moment to consider the dominant narratives of our own time, the stories we tell about economics, about progress, about national identity, about success. What myths do we live by, often without even realizing it? We are surrounded by modern tales that shape our laws, our aspirations, and our conflicts, stories that feel as inevitable and solid as the myth of divine kingship must have felt to an ancient Egyptian. But just as a single scroll could rewrite the rules of an entire civilization, the recovery of a forgotten perspective can shatter the foundations of our own certainties. It invites us to ask what truths about our own society might be buried, waiting for a curious mind to unearth them. What alternative blueprints for our world are currently dismissed or ignored? The most exciting discoveries are not always found in the ground. They can be found by challenging the stories we have been taught to take for granted. We would love to hear which of these lost myths resonated most deeply with you. Was it the Norse vision of a peaceful world reborn from the ashes of Ragnarök? Or perhaps the Minoan ideal of a leader who mastered the art of ritual and trade over warfare? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's continue this fascinating conversation. The exploration of history's deepest secrets is a collective adventure, and your curiosity is the most important tool we have. If this journey has sparked a desire to look beneath the surface of the past, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Together, we will keep digging, keep questioning, and keep listening for the whispers of those long-lost voices that still have so much to teach us about who we are and who we might